Welcome and a warm good evening. If the day has been loud, let this be your quiet harbor. Settle your shoulders, slow your breath, and let the noise drift like smoke. We'll walk softly into the past together, unhurried, curious, and awake to its echoes. I love knowing where these nights find you. Tell me below what city keeps you company, and what hour has the clock chosen there? It's a small thread, but it ties this community across time zones. If these calm journeys through deep history help you unwind, consider subscribing. It's the surest way to meet here again, as we keep opening hidden doors in the story of the world. Now, when you're comfortable, we'll begin. She was stolen in the night. He was a fugitive with a promise. Bring her home, avenge the insult. That rescue forged alliances, shattered tribes, and lit the fuse of the largest contiguous empire on Earth. One woman's abduction became the spark that made Genghis Khan. The last light of the day slid off the grass like water, leaving the plain the color of cooling iron. Tents stood in a loose crescent beside the stream, their ropes humming faintly in the breeze. In the middle of the camp, a small fire kept close to the ground, more ember than flame, careful not to draw attention on the open steppe. Inside the bridal tent, Bert rested with her head on a rolled cloak, listening to the slow tick of the horse bells tied just beyond the felt wall. The camp talked in whispers that evening. The wedding gifts had been counted, the mares milked, the elders satisfied with the songs. Temujin had ridden out late to check the pickets. When his shadow withdrew, Bert could still feel the warm pressure of his hand on her wrist, the quiet promise the two of them had been making since childhood. We have chosen each other against hunger, winter, and the gossip of powerful families. The wind changed. From far off, where the stars were just beginning to pronounce themselves, a darker movement unstitched the horizon. Hoofbeats arrived as a rumor, and then as a command. A hawk lifted from the riverbank. The dogs slept on. The assault descended the way steppe storms do, complete and unarguable. The first rider drove straight through the cooking fire, scattering coals into the bedding sand. Others swarmed the horse line. A woman screamed once and was cut off by a hand on her mouth. Men reached for boughs they had stored to honor the wedding truce. By the time the strings found their notch, the tents were surrounded. Through the felt wall, Bert heard the only sound she would remember clearly for years, the thudding, not of a weapon, but of a saddle hitting the ground as someone jumped down beside her door. The flap yanked wide. Night poured in. Two Merkit warriors stood in the opening, faces masked against the dust. One grabbed her arm. She fought with the exact force of someone who knows the rules and hates them. On the steppe, bride taking could be a bargain or a crime depending on whose horse arrived first. An uncle might steal a bride with her consent to avoid a heavy bride price. A rival might raid to humiliate a smaller clan. The line between ritual and assault was thinner than a bowstring. Bert had grown up inside this math and still felt the shock of it. Marriage, for her, had been the first time that choosing had outweighed being chosen. The man in the doorway tore the veil free and threw it in the fire, laughing. They bound her hands. They shouted her name incorrectly and a village many days north that would claim her. She saw one of Temujin's younger brothers in the dirt. with blood on his lip, a boy's eyes trying to harden into a man's. The world shrank to the heat of the rope and the cold of the night air as they lifted her onto a spare horse. She disappeared into the dark with her captors, a smudge of movement against the river. Temujin reached the camp as the ashes finished arguing with the wind. He dismounted before his horse had stopped, crossed the ring of trampled grass in 3 steps, and knelt where the tent pole had fallen. There was a dent in the sand where a heel had slipped, and a long furrow where someone had been dragged. He pressed his palm into the imprints until grit stuck to his skin. No one needed to tell him who had carried her off. The Merkits had wronged his family before. Once they had seized his mother from her first husband. This was an old quarrel wearing new clothes. Revenge on that plane wasn't anger. It was arithmetic, the book you kept to make sure the world still added up. Someone brought a skin of kumis and he pushed it away. He stood and said nothing for a long time, and then he spoke the sentence. Every veteran in the camp recognized as a commitment, not a wish. We will ride north in the morning. The vow reached beyond love. A small household without allies doesn't last a season. An insult like this would attract others who smelled weakness. If he did not act quickly, he would have to move every few days, burning horses and strength until enemies didn't have to chase him. The steppes law was reciprocity. Return what is taken, pay what is owed, worse if you cannot pay in kind. He needed help on a scale he had never asked for. He went first to Togrul, Ong Khan of the Kherate, who had once treated him like a foster son. Temujin arrived under a flag of humility with a sable coat across his arms. When he laid the coat at the older man's feet, it wasn't just a gift. It was an adoption ritual. He was asking to be recognized as a son who could call on his fathers. Riders and in time obey his father's summons in return. Togrul accepted the fur with a smile that made every man in the tent exhale. The Kherite had their own problems with the Merkit and no love for their raiding style. Joining a rescue was both justice and opportunity. Temujin then sought Jamuka, the blood brother of his youth. They had shared a mantle once, sealing an Anda's vow beside a quiet fire. 2 lads who had slept out under the same sky and promised to bring each other through whatever the future called winter. Jamuka heard him out and nodded. Part loyalty, part calculation, Temujin's misfortune gave Jamuka a chance to parade his generosity and remind the steppe that he could put his weight behind a cause quickly. The 3 hosts met near a bend in the Selenge under a sky that promised frost. Scouts returned with the story of Bert's path. The Merkit had driven hard, changing mounts, cutting across reed beds to draw the pursuit into slow ground. Temujin laid the track lines on a patch of sand and felt the distances into his fingers. He described the shape of the land as if it were a saddle he had already tried, and instructed the Kherite to loop wide while Jamuka took the ridge. His own company would slide along the river and push the Merkit camp into the pocket the others would close. The raid broke before dawn. Frost hardened the grass and the far hills had that metallic glow that arrives just before sunlight. Temujin's men approached with reins wrapped and arrowheads muffled in wool. The camp ahead slept the sleep of victors who believe the debt will not be collected today. Someone's breath fogged too high. Someone laughed in a whisper. A dog lifted its head and finding only familiar smells, put it back down. When the first horn sounded, it was far off, where Jamukha's riders came down like a moving fence. The second blast folded the camp inward when the Karaite appeared behind the lines. Then the riverbank came alive with men whose faces no one could read in that half-light. Tents collapsed. Horse pickets snapped. The world reverted to velocity. In the confusion, Bert was brought from the felt shelter of the man who had claimed her. She moved with the formal dignity of someone who has learned, in a matter of nights, how to carry herself like an object while keeping her mind in a place no one could reach. A market guard grabbed for her sleeve. Temujin's brother knocked him sideways with a club. Two Karaite lancers pushed through the doorway and lifted her between them, setting her gently onto a waiting mare. The image stamped itself into every witness. Bert, back in his saddle under her own people's hands, turned toward home. The assault ended quickly because it had a single purpose. Temujin cut down as few men as necessary to break the ring and pull back. They left the enemy alive enough to remember who had done this and why. The steppe counted such messages as currency. Later that day, the three commanders met on the ridge where dry grass hid the ground stones. Temujin dismounted and walked to Bert and bowed, not as a chieftain to a captive, but as a husband asking if she could ride farther. She nodded. The small movement carried more weight than any cheer. The return was not triumphal. Silence rode with them. Bert's maid sat close behind and beneath her breath recited the old words for calming frightened mares. Temujin rode at a distance, giving her space, answering the men who came up to report casualties with one-word questions. Who, where, how many? He ordered the distribution of spoils to those who had lost brothers. As the sun lowered, they stopped at a shallow ravine to water the horses. Bert stepped down and stood with her hands on the mare's neck. She wasn't a symbol in that moment. She was a person trying to remember how to belong to herself. Temujin approached only when she looked over, and even then he spoke first about practical things, how long to rest, which track to take, to give her back the right to refuse conversation. She did not refuse. They said little of the days apart. They both understood the steppe's habit of turning private harm into public policy. That evening he sat with his mother, Holan, whose own life had begun again from capture. She told him what he already knew. A household that doesn't answer an insult invites another. The raid had returned Bert, but the logic that made the raid possible still prowled. You can run a long time, she said, or you can make a place where running isn't necessary. The rescue had changed the size of his vow. Before, he had sworn to return a wife. Now the obligation enlarged to something audacious. Reshape a world that rewarded the strong for stealing the weak. He did not yet have the language of law or empire. He had horses, brothers, the memory of humiliation, and two allies whose goodwill flickered with its own ambitions. But he had something rarer. Everyone had seen him ask for help without losing himself. Togrul had been honored as a father. Jamukha had tasted the old warmth of brotherhood and the new taste of rivalry when the men cheered. Temujin's planning more than Jamukha's speed. The tale of the rescue ran ahead of them. Camps across the Annan repeated it with professional interest. Here was a young leader who avenged his home quickly, who paid his allies correctly, and who did not stay to gorge on meat and trophies when the work was finished. That combination efficiency without vanity can become a magnet on the steppe. It pulls loose men from failing chiefs and gives miserable families a reason to gamble their future. The wedding feast that never finished resumed in a quieter key. Elders offered short toasts. The singers chose a song about a hawk that returns to the glove after storms. Some of the younger riders who had never been this close to Temujin's fire lingered, trying to memorize how he spoke to Bert and to his mother, hoping to understand what kind of leader they were tying their lives to. He did not perform. He ate. He listened to inventory reports. He made sure those who had lost kin were fed first. Later, when most had rolled into furs, he and Bert sat facing the dark and shared the bitter, warm milk left in the pot. He told her about the promise he had made in his head as he pressed his hand into the footprint beside the tent, the promise that this would be the last time their camp looked small. She nodded once. The next morning he sent riders with gifts to Togrul and Jamuka. Gratitude kept doors open. He also dispatched scouts along market routes with instructions not to fight, but to count. He wanted to know precisely which clans had joined the raid, which cousins had looked away, which families were wavering. The map forming in his head was not drawn on leather. It was a ledger of debts and loyalties that could be converted into alliances faster than winter could erase tracks. News arrived in pieces. The Merkits fled to their deeper camps. Some boasted they would return to take payment with interest. Others had learned the new calculation Temujin could bring help faster than their pride could bring reinforcements. Within weeks, he convened his own small council, men who had ridden long enough with him to speak frankly. He asked them what they wanted the story to be a year from now. One said safety on the winter pastures. Another said fewer raids. A third whispered what others feared to say aloud: respect across tribes. He surprised them by agreeing to all three and saying the only way to get them was to make rules everyone could predict and punishments no one could escape. The vision was not yet the Yasa, but it angled toward it. Bert listened from the shadow of the tent pole. Her gaze moved between faces and the fire. She understood as well as any man in the ring that a private home repaired by mercy can become a public example. She also knew that every example has a cost. Someone will test it. Someone will die for it. Someone will write a song about it that forgets the woman at the center. A moon later, Temujin led a precise strike against the raiders' cousins, not to annihilate them, but to make them choose. He captured families who had supplied horses to the kidnappers and released them after taking oaths. He placed watchers at the river crossings. He visited yurts whose elders had looked the other way and spoke to them with the patience of a man who had rehearsed the speech lifting Bert to her mare. You can live under the old math where theft balances theft, or you can try a new one where you keep what you build because the rules don't blow away with the snow. That winter, the camp felt larger, though the number of tents had not changed. Confidence makes a circle wide. Bert regained her routines and her place in the household, not as something returned, but as a partner whose experience now carried political gravity. She had seen what men do when they think nobody will come. She had survived being a prize and refused to be reduced to one. When the first signs of pregnancy appeared, Older women kept counsel and looked toward Temujin carefully. He made his choice quickly and did not revisit it in public. The child would be his. Recognition wasn't forgiveness. It was architecture, the first pillar in a house he meant to build, so that storms would spend themselves on the outer walls. The memory of the night she was taken did not fade. It hardened into a story he told himself whenever he felt the old uncertainty return. Every campaign he planned afterward contained the shadow of that night, the wind, the dog that did not bark, the sudden hands. He resolved to make an order that didn't require every camp to keep watch without sleep. His vow, once just a husband's promise, had become the outline of a statesman's project. When riders from smaller families came to join his banner, they did not say they were drawn by promises of loot. They said they were tired of doors that could be kicked in at midnight. They said they were tired of counting the daughters they did not have anymore. He gave them an answer made not of mercy alone, but of structure, a roster, a captain, a share, a rule. The steppe is a giant with a short attention span. It remembers only what is repeated every season. Temujin began repeating a new rhythm-swift answer to injury, measured mercy afterward, and the insistent message that tomorrow could be more predictable than yesterday, if men would stop worshipping the chaos that made them feel important. The vow he spoke over the ashes of the bridal camp was still burning. It would pull elders into councils, estrange old friends who loved their privileges, and draft daughters into politics as tightly as sons into battle. Before long, it would take him beyond revenge into something larger and more dangerous, the work of making other people's nights safe. Milk was the first lesson Temujin learned about power, and iron was the second. Milk, because survival on the steppe belongs to those who can turn grass into blood and breath through an animal's body. Iron, because hooves and blades make every promise keepable. Both were taught by women. Before Temujin could walk, his mother had already carried a story into his bones. The day a young bride named Holan was riding with her husband, Chilidu and a band of Borjigin warriors cut the path, chased the groom away, and took the bride. Yasuge, Temujin's father, did what raiders did. He stole a life to begin another. Holan didn't cry in the telling. She made her children repeat the facts plainly, the way you teach a herd to follow a rope. You can be taken. You can also take back. She never asked them to pity her. She asked them to understand the arithmetic of their world. She had been torn from one hearth and used that violence to build another. Now the hearth had to be defended without apology. When Yasuge died poisoned after accepting a Tatar feast, protection evaporated. The clan dumped Holan and the children on the far margins, a patch of river with no allies and no animals worth naming. That exile shaped everything. Temujin was old enough to carry a snare and young enough to feel his hand shake from hunger. The family boiled roots, dug marmot dens, and stole scraps of bone from abandoned wolf kills. Holan ran the household like a miniature campaign. Everyone was assigned a task, everyone reported, no one hoarded. She organized the day around scarcity with the precision emperors eventually envy. At night, when the wind slapped the felt walls, she whispered maps into the firelight, not lines on leather, but stories about who owed whom, which uncles had weak spines, which neighbors fed their dogs before their daughters. and why those details mattered as much as knowing where rivers bent. Leadership, as she gave it to her children, was a pot of Mare's milk and a ledger of debts, memorized in the dark. Temujin's childhood was a field exercise in reading movement. He learned to judge a stranger's intentions by the way he handled a cup, to sense an ambush from the behavior of scavenger birds, to measure his own worth by the quiet he could hold while waiting. When brothers fought over fish or trinket, Holun ended it without spectacle. She separated them, redistributed what little they had, and repeated the rule he would later build an empire around: you keep a house through fairness first and force second. When fairness fails, you are already late. She taught him to beg without shame when survival required it, and to return favors with interest when help arrived. From her, he learned that gratitude outlives fear. Years later, men would call him ruthless and then follow him anyway. The explanation sat beside that river. A teenager watched his mother keep 6 stomachs, full without a herd, and decided order was a kind of worship. Marriage to Bert did not place a jewel on his arm. It gave him a second commander. She came from the Anjurat with a dowry of kinship and the habit of being listened to. On the steppe, households are moving governments, and women run the ministries. They portion grain, assign tents, mediate grievances, decide when to break camp, and turn gossip into intelligence. Bert's Ordo became a communications hub, a place where herders, midwives, and wives of junior captains traded the news that never reaches formal councils. She knew whose child had fallen sick, which family was reluctant to join the spring migration, which elder privately admired Temujin's insistence on merit over pedigree. Women's networks traveled faster than scouts because they moved in daylight and nobody bothered to stop them. Temujin asked Bert to sit near the tent door in council, not as ornament, but because she heard what men avoided saying. She had a gift for ranking urgencies. This quarrel will break a band in winter. That raid can wait. That promise, if kept, will create 3 new allies you can trust. She noticed cooks hiding poor meat for themselves, then sent extra grain quietly. That sort of gesture seeds a rumor. Our leader's tent sees us. When the herd swelled and the camp stretched farther along the water, Bert reorganized the carts to move at a single pace so no family peeled off, the portable version of loyalty. She didn't need a seal to govern. She managed through logistics and courtesy, which in nomad society are more binding than paper. The abduction scar never fully scabbed over. After Bert returned, her first pregnancy brought the question everyone was too experienced not to think about: whose son will this be in people's mouths? Joki's birth pulled Temujin into the tightest corridor of leadership choosing. What to do when truth is muddy and politics will not leave it alone. Rivals murmured that a Merkit had ceded his line. Temujin knew the math of dates, and he also knew the math of coalitions. He refused to let gossip own his future. In front of elders and brothers, he said, "Joki is mine." The declaration wasn't romance. It was architecture. If he repudiated his firstborn, he cut his wife in half, insulted his own protection vow, and invited every petty chieftain to claim the right to decide his household for him. By naming Joki as son, he taught his followers the rules of belonging. Loyalty creates kin as surely as blood. That decision did not erase jealousy. Chagatai never forgot the timeline. In private, he grumbled. In public, he stressed law. The brothers' rivalry became rehearsal for a bigger question. Will this new order be old aristocracy in new clothes, or will it actually favor competence? Temujin handled it with a mixture of tests and theater. He gave Joki difficult assignments, far from the core long hunts that demanded patience, raids that required mercy after victory, negotiations with border tribes who measured masculinity by restraint. He watched how men reported after serving under Joki. Did they feel used or seen? Did the camp return with new friends or just new trophies? He didn't need to prove paternity. He needed to prove that the boy carried the habits required to hold a nation together. Bert dealt with the same strain from a different angle. She understood the quiet cost of Temujin's public stance and absorbed it with a kind of disciplined calm that made other wives and mothers imitate her. In the women's circles, she protected Joki from casual cruelty without creating more enemies for him. She knew when to speak for him and when to let him answer. She placed trusted women in his household, so disputes reached her before they reached the elders. Through her, maternity became statecraft. The empire later bragged about its horse archers. It survived because Kitchen stayed loyal. Holun's role barely softened with age. She remained the spine of the tent, the teller of the origin story that justified all the risk. You were abandoned and you lived. Therefore, nobody gets to say what you can't build. When cousins asked for favor, Holun evaluated not their pedigree, but the winter they had survived last year. She alone could look Temujin in the face and stop him from a petty revenge. When he wanted to break a family because a nephew had insulted him, she reminded him of the year their own pride would have starved them if not for a neighbor's leftover cheese. Her memory narrowed the margin between justice and pettiness. Many great men learned to correct subordinates. Few have anyone strong enough to correct them. Holun did, and Temujin listened because the correction came. Wrapped in unforgotten hunger, anthropologists, reading the step through modern. Lenses talk about bride capture as custom. But on the ground, it was a lottery that remade lives by force. Holun and Bert both had been thrown into that lottery and refused to stay lucky or unlucky. They converted violation into leverage. They turned marriages into alliances that had obligations flowing both directions, not one. They hoarded no debt they could collect early, preferring to let obligations accrue until the return would be transformative. This is how revenge grows sophisticated. It stops looking like blood and begins to look like rules. Temujin absorbed the lesson at levels he never named. The Yasa he would later codify protection for envoys, standardized punishment for theft, strict discipline against betrayal, echoed the logic of women who are tired of being stolen. Create expectations you can enforce. Make predictability the greatest gift you give followers. See the household as the empire's drill school. If a mother can keep 5 children from tearing each other during a winter of nettle soup, a general can keep 50 captains from splitting a province over pride. The women's influence also altered Temujin's diplomacy. He didn't just marry for romance or for horses. He married to knit the frontier into the center. Daughters went to governors and princes with dowries of confidence and a license to enforce fairness in their new settlements. Those marriages were not solely about obedience to an emperor. They were about stability that mothers could recognize in their sleep. When a garrison city under a daughter's household ran its market without cheating and kept taxes on time, it pleased the emperor less than it pleased every woman who didn't want her children dragged into a stranger's tent by debt collectors. The ordo itself, the moving palace of carts, felt, ropes, cooks, saddles, weavers, was a female-run organism. Where it camped, the empire had a brain. When it rolled, the empire had legs. Men planned the next day's ride. Women decided where the wheels would not break. They chose the ground with water that wouldn't poison the calves and pasture that wouldn't exhaust the mares. They organized the rotation of milkers, the store of dried curds, the portion of meat that went to widows. These were not domestic afterthoughts. They were the supply chain that made genius in battle possible. When chroniclers said the Mongol army could appear anywhere a day early, strong enough to fight, they were describing a miracle driven by decisions made beside churns and stoves in the intimate sphere. Temujin's temper could burn quick as a summer fire, but the women around him sanded the sparks down without making him feel diminished. Bert had a way of refusing him that didn't harden into defiance. She'd say, "If you do this, I will carry the result," and he would hear the weight he was about to shift onto her back. Holland wielded shame more sparingly but effectively. She used the past like a whetstone. We did not survive that river to become men who forget gratitude. Between them, they guided a talented, volatile man toward a leader whose self-control became part of his brand. The consequences showed most clearly in succession politics. When it became obvious that Joki and Chagatai would not share a saddle gracefully, Temujin chose Gedi as a compromise. The choice did not prove that Joki lacked his father's faith. It proved that the women's long tutoring in stability had sunk deep. Pick the son who can hold the council together, not the strongest fist. Later historians would praise or criticize the decision through the achievements of the successors, but on the day it was made, it was the logic of a household that had survived precarious years by valuing the patient administrator who kept everyone fed. The hearth had become the throne's rehearsal room. All of this recalibrated vengeance. Early in his life, revenge meant filling a footprint with your own boot, paying back exactly what was owed. Under the influence of the women who held his world upright, revenge matured into policy. It did not evaporate. It changed weapons. Insult became pretext for reform. Theft became an opportunity to extend law. Kidnapping and rescue taught him the rhetoric that would persuade clans to dissolve into a nation. You can live inside chaos and call it freedom, or you can live inside rules and call it peace. Women who refused to break turned one man's anger into a program others could trust. When the world later called him Genghis Khan and tried to make the story only about iron and fear, the older tale still ran like a river below the river, a girl taken from one husband, who built another life without asking permission. A bride carried across a night and delivered back to a tent whose owner refused to let gossip amputate his family. A mother who rationed milk, a wife who rationed fury. A leader who learned that empires hold only if households do. Revenge did not ignite in a single night. It fermented in the patience of women who fed hungry mouths and put a spine into a boy with nothing except their will the rescue did not close the account. It set the exchange rate. Through autumn and into the first snow, Temujin kept his saddle warm and his horses lean, tracking the merchant across river mouths and cedar groves, hitting small camps at dawn and vanishing before the smoke knew which way the wind wanted to blow. He was not trying to exterminate a people. He was sending a signal that could be read in any dialect on the steppe. If you seize families, families will come back for you, and they will arrive organized. Each raid tore another thread from the merchant net. Chiefs who had supported the abduction paid horses and women, sometimes sons, as compensation. Temujin took restitution, then took something more valuable pledges. He released those who swore to leave his people alone. When a vow was broken, the answer arrived faster the second time. Bands who watched from the edges saw a pattern and decided it was safer to ride with a man who paid wages than with a chief who paid compliments. The first recruits were runaways and hard-luck herders with 2 mares and nowhere to winter. They arrived suspicious, hands near knife hilts, heads full of older oaths. Temujin met them with a rule no noble had offered before. What you earn is yours, and your worth is measured by what you do next. He redistributed loot publicly, not behind the felt of a chieftain's tent. He made lists, gave command over tens to the man whose voice could keep 9 others steady when arrows started to land. The decimal structure grew not out of mathematics, but from the memory of a hungry household that needed fair shares. Tens became hundreds. Hundreds fused into thousands. The army skeleton appeared under the skin of a revenge campaign, where his father's generation had traded protection for lifelong fealty. Temujin offered something more transactional and, therefore, more attractive to the poor. Protection now, advancement tomorrow, and spoils that did not disappear into a cousin's cart. He promised the weakest people a predictable price for their loyalty grain rations, winter pasture, and a place in the line. Raiders who joined discovered that punishment for theft inside the camp came quicker than punishment for fear on the field. He banned kidnapping inside his tents, a sharp contrast to the casual brutality that had shaped his childhood. Women who entered the Ordo under his banner were counted, fed, assigned work, and made part of a network that even senior captains learned to respect. The revenge of a single night began to look like a social program. News of this novelty traveled farther than his horses could in a day. To men who had been standing at the edge of power all their lives, an offer of merit sounded like a passport. To aristocrats who had grown fat allocating favors, it sounded like treason. Jamuka, the blood brother of Temujin's youth, embodied their position as well as anyone. He was brilliant, generous to his equals, and committed to the dignity of the old order. He believed a nation is a display case for its nobility, and that commoners must know their place if the center is to hold. Temujin increasingly believed the center was wherever men kept promises. Their divergence began with small decisions that felt like etiquette. Temujin moved his camp to make pasture available to poorer families. Jamuka stayed where his lineage said he belonged. Temujin promoted a blacksmith's son over a noble's nephew. Jamuka demoted 3 boys who had stood too close to a council fire. A group of young men defected from Jamuka's camp and were captured. Jamuka had them boiled alive to discourage disobedience. The decision was not senseless, fear holds as well as love, but it made 1,000 quiet judgments in 1,000 tents. People who had always expected cruelty decided they didn't want to be quite that predictable anymore. Herders began arriving at Temujin's lines with their saddlebags stripped down to necessities and their exasperation packed like rain. They didn't kneel. They enumerated grievances and asked what the new boss intended to do about them. He listened in the way hungry men have to listen. He promised 3 things that were not standard on the steppe: escorts for caravans under his protection, settled winter pastures that wouldn't be arbitrarily stolen by cousins of cousins, and trial for thefts inside the Ordo that wouldn't be settled by quiet brides. He refused to treat these men as clients. He called them companions, Noker, and he meant it. That language, plus his method of distributing plunder to widows and men who had lost kin first, pulled loyalty out of groups who had never imagined feeling loyal to anyone besides their grandfather's ghost. The Ordo expanded. The car train grew longer. New tents blossomed beside the river like mushrooms after a rain. Women's councils Bert's realm kept pace, establishing rules for mills, scheduling rotations for milkers and guards, and maintaining a registry of disputes that rarely reached Temujin because they were solved before men had a chance to make them worse. The larger he became, the more he threatened the ecology of privilege that had fed Jamuka's power. Their final break came at a place where a new camp boundary chafed an old honor. Younger men crossed from Jamuka's side to Temujin's with their families. They were caught and flogged back. Temujin sent a messenger to demand their return. Jamuka sent the messenger's head back tied to a horse's tail. The codes of Andas, the brotherhood that had joined them as boys, were suddenly inadequate to the politics of men. Each summoned partners. Some chiefs chose Jamuka because their pride felt safer with him. Others chose Temujin because their children might. The civil war that followed was not all banners and trumpet calls. It was a long scrape of movement as streams of carts tried to outguess one another across grasslands with very few hiding places. Coalitions formed and cracked again. The Karaite king Togral drifted favorable when it helped, cold when other nobles whispered that Temujin's rise would make him a servant in his old age. Rivers stole horses. Sickness stole confidence. The men did not know they were fighting history. They knew they were fighting exhaustion. Temujin's strength lay in the discipline he had already taught. Commands ran by numbers, not by genealogy. Families displaced by the marching found food waiting at the next stop because women had planned for it. Messengers could find commanders in the dark because they were always in the same place in the line. Jamuka's strength lay in a faster coalition machine. His name could still bring a lot of hooves to a lot of horizons. The question was how long such men would stay for someone else's glory. The battle that forced the question came on a cold morning when the grass rattled like brittle paper and horses blew steam. Both armies stared across a strip of slightly higher ground. Temujin arranged his center out of men who had slept under his laws for years and put the defectors, who had joined yesterday, on the wings where they could feel tested but not crucial. He told the older captains, push, then stop, then breathe. He had already ordered a false retreat drilled for months, one of those step tricks that works only if timing is as trustworthy as a heartbeat. Jamuka hit first. He liked to announce himself, and his opening charge screamed magnificence. Temujin's center absorbed it without breaking. His wings peeled away as if frightened. Jamuka's line stretched to follow. Then Temujin's reserve poured through the gap. When the dust moved like a curtain, the field flipped. Courage still mattered, but it now reported to a system that multiplied it. The fight ran through the afternoon. A buffalo-colored haze rose from ground pounded to powder. Screams became background noise of the kind soldiers, learned to ignore so they can do their work. By evening, Jamuka's coalition had become a collection of separate improvisations. The men who stayed with him fought like men who believed in a name rather than a plan. The men who slipped away did so with the relief of those who have been carrying a stone they didn't choose. He retreated with a band of faithful nobles, trading speed for dignity, keeping to high ridges where the wind led them. Here a pursuer's mistake. Temujin didn't chase blindly. He sent groups to the places where a rider escaping honor would have to sleep. Over months, the net closed. When Jamuka was finally betrayed by his own followers and delivered to Temujin bound, the future ruler presented the result as stagecraft aimed at every fire on the steppe. He ordered the betrayers executed for betrayal, not for their choice of target. Then he brought Jamuka into the tent. The two men had faced each other as boys around a cooking fire. Now they faced each other as models of incompatible futures. Temujin offered the old Anda a place at his side. Jamuka refused. He asked to die like a noble without his blood spilled. Temujin granted it. The method the executioners used ended life by breaking the spine, a death the steppe interpreted as both merciful and respectful of rank. The optics mattered. In one sequence, Temujin told the country 4 things. Desertion to him would not shield treachery. The law applied without convenience. An old friend would not be publicly humiliated, and the new order would not be founded on petty vengeance. The message reached small camps faster than it reached palaces. Women who kept lists of whose sons were dead balanced those lists against other lists who had been spared, who had eaten, who had a future in this tent. Their math came out in Temujin's favor. With Jamuka gone, the old apparatus of nobility-first governance still had spokes and hubs, but the axle was broken. Temujin moved quickly to fill the vacuum before it drew in other dangers. He told families joining his banner that they were not second class. They were 10th-man leaders if they could hold the line. He made sure the first new commanders were men of unexceptional birth. He set trials in the open so punishments looked like decisions, not temper. He kept his promises about spoils. He demanded that those under his protection stop raiding inside the house. He did not wait for a formal coronation to act like a system. Of course, not everyone converted. The Tayaciad pulled back into forests. A cluster of Naaman nobles called him a grasping upstart. But the center of gravity had moved. Caravan leaders brought him their fear of toll collectors and criminal way stations. He built relay stations and enforced penalties against waylayer chiefs by sending their grandchildren back with food rather than sending back their heads. That sort of paradox mercy that cost nothing and bought entire clans was new enough to feel like religion. He also knew when to frighten. In one town that murdered envoys, He took the leaders and wrote their names into the earth with stakes while letting the rest of the people return to work. Men who sung that episode with the word cruelty weren't wrong. Men who summed it with the word stable roads were not wrong either. He was composing a language that used both words and expected people to live with the key contradiction. The banner under which this language marched held more than fabric. The white peace standards of 9 yak tails were raised when agreements were being negotiated. The black war standard of horsehair went out when talk had failed. People learned to look at the standards and understand what week it was. Around the standards, Temujin arranged the country he was still inventing. He matched tent lines to river curves and taught captains to maintain position by sighting poles at dawn. He assigned hunting grounds. He moved families like furniture to make the rooms flow. He cut through meaningless rites and kept the ones that made a crowd breathe together. He knew music was a weapon. He ordered new songs that praised service, not ancestry. He let old songs survive as long as they stopped being laws. The stories told later made this chapter neat. Rescue leads to war. War leads to victory. Victory leads to empire. The reality was a grind. Climate mattered. So did horse sickness. So did whether a chief's wife had embarrassed another chief's wife over a pot of boiling milk 3 years ago. Temujin's gift lay in making the grind feel like a direction. He repeated the same verbal shapes until they became instincts. Promise, performance, payment. Trespass, judgment, forgiveness if useful. Loyalty elevated. Betrayal named and punished. Bravery fed and remembered. Men who had spent their lives guessing what nerve they might tread on grew, used to a leader whose nerves were visible in the rules. One evening, as the camp moved after a long halt, a boy in charge of 10 families stepped into Temujin's path to report a cart axle failure. The boy had expected a blow. He received a smile and a replacement. That small moment slipped through the ordo like smoke. Fear demoted 1 notch. Readiness promoted 1 notch. Multiply that by thousands, and a nation begins to breathe the same rhythm. After Jamuka, Temujin turned the Merkit campaign into a policy of containment. If they raided, he retaliated in hours where possible and in weeks where not. He captured leaders and demanded oaths of peace. He allowed those oaths to turn into marriages, and those marriages to turn into new lines on the ledger. He did not make the same mistake Jamuka had made. He never required too much of the proud all at once. He required slightly less than they could bear, so they could keep their faces and still belong. When the steppe finally realized that something like a country had taken shape, it was not at a coronation. It was in the way caravans started leaving heavier and arriving unrobbed. It was in the fact that messengers traveled at night and did not die. It was in the sudden boredom of 1,000 petty chiefs who had lost their principal hobby, tormenting travelers, and now had to learn to be useful or move. Revenge had turned into recruitment, recruitment into a system, and the system into a banner that meant tomorrow might be worth planning for. The last act of this transformation was a play. Temujin staged for an audience of skeptics. He invited rival elders to watch a distribution of plunder after a successful spring raid. The ritual was silent, almost clerical. He handed out bolts of silk to widows first, then each man who had lost a brother, then captains according to a list made before the fighting. He took the last share and gave it to a boy who had moved a herd across ice during a blizzard while the rest slept. The old men wanted to hate him and found themselves calculating how many of their own people might drift his way. If word of this got out, the vow that started beside a torn tent rope had become a proposition. If you join me, your family will wake. Under the same rules it slept under. The powerful will be bound like everyone else. And when we strike, you will eat. Enough people believed the proposition to change geography. A new map was being drawn not on leather, but in the expectations of thousands who had decided that the past had had them long enough, on a spring plain where the grass rose to a horse's knee. The tents drew into a circle until the horizon looked like a vast ring. Chiefs came with their best saddles and their most complicated smiles. Families set cooking stones in lines the way cities arrange streets. The Kurultai was not a throne room. It was a weather event that men entered by consent. Banners of horsehair stood in the center like tall reeds. A day earlier those tails had hung white for peace. Now the black standards waited, taut as the air before rained out. Authority here did not descend from a pedestal. It sounded itself into being. First elders spoke in the cadence of winter fires, reciting the ledger of favors and wrongs. Then captains described what they had seen with their own eyes. A singer wove memory into rhythm so the story no one owned became the story everyone shared. When Temujin stepped forward, he did not declaim. He mentioned bread, roads, judgment, and where the herd should winter. He asked for oaths that could be kept. The crowd answered the only way that matters on an empty plain, by standing as one. Acclamation is politics without walls. It pulls the individual into the physical posture of belonging and then leaves him there long enough for his doubts to look like cowardice. The vote was simple, either voices and bodies aligned, or the circle fractured. When the elders lifted Temujin on a felt rug, the gesture said nothing about divine right and everything about shared risk. Men who contribute to a lift take responsibility for the weight. The new title arrived like a weather change, audible more than visible. He was called by a name that announced measure rather than spectacle, Genghis Khan. While others argued over what the syllables meant, he immediately set about making them mean what he needed. Law came first, and it came from the tongue, not from paper. In a society that moves, rules cannot be bricks. They must be breath. He gathered the reliable captains, the canny mothers, the caravan masters with fair reputations, and the envoys who had watched more courts than any noble. They sat in a felt pavilion and gave simple choices, simple words. Do not steal within the tent or from allied camps. Do not seize a woman of your own house or of a house allied to the tent. Do not lie to a commander in battle. Do not abandon a comrade. Do not kill an envoy. The list grew with the day, but it remained a list that could be memorized while riding at speed. The Yasa that resulted was less a code carved once for all time than a set of expectations enforced with theater. Its genius lay in predictability and in the sense that everyone, from the Khan's cousins to the newest recruit, had stepped into the same corridor. Religious practice was left to conscience. Shamans, monks, priests, and mullahs found that their altars were safest when they cared about fairness as much as doctrine. An envoy who traveled under the Khan's sign enjoyed the same protection. as a child of the Ordo. Anyone who touched him forfeited all bargaining rights and sometimes their lineage's confidence for a generation. Caravans learned that compensation would be paid if an officer lost self-control. The steppe discovered that law could be both stern and reliable, and reliability felt like water in a dry month. The punishments were not invented to shock. They were selected because they carried the story into the stands where gossip perched. Theft from a comrade led to public repayment, often more than the value. Repeated theft led to expulsion. Desertion counted as a disease that could kill 1,000. The cure was permanent. Rape turned a private crime into a public one. The guilty were made to understand that the household and the army were a single organism and that violating one meant weakening the other. In this way, the Yasa did something brilliant and cold. It took the brutality that had once been casual and renamed it treason. Casualty of habit became casualty of law. Orders, to avoid becoming sermons, needed structure. Temujin cut the camp into a pattern that became a machine. Men were placed in tens with a leader who knew every face by voice and gait. 10 tens made 100, 10 hundreds made 1,000, 10 thousands formed the basic arm. The organization multiplied loyalty by shrinking responsibility. When chaos threatened, a soldier's first duty was to the 9 nearest. In a panic, a man's voice carries to 10. Promotions traveled upward without detouring through pedigree. A boy who steadied others under fire could find himself commanding men who had once called him by a childhood nickname. Resentment did not vanish, but it had to argue with results. Drill introduced choreography into a culture that had trusted impulse. Riders practiced the false retreat in elaborate loops until the wildest horse in the string could predict when to wheel. Signals became compressed. A single flag tugged at. A specific angle replaced a dozen orders shouted into wind. In this geometry, every movement was a sentence with subject and verb. War turned from spectacle into grammar, and grammar turned men dangerous without needing them to become brutal. A law that stays in one place dies. Temujin knew this. He built a network that could move ideas faster than horse thieves. The yam relay posts, spaced a day's ride apart, seemed like an afterthought to poets. But to merchants and officers, it felt like civilization. Fresh mounts, shelter, and official food rations waited at each station. Couriers carried wooden tablets with notches that matched cords sealed in the capital. Counterfeiting required an artistry few possessed. A message that would have taken 20 days could now arrive in 5. And accuracy increased because the courier's memory did not have to carry every syllable. A governor in a city 1,000 miles from the Ordo could be reminded of a promise he had hoped would be forgotten. A commander on a frontier could describe a flood and receive advice before the new moon. Words needed shapes before they could be shared across languages. Temujin adopted the Uyghur script and prepared clerks who could jump between tongues without losing the meaning in the potholes. Decrees were recited in Mongolian, written in a script learned from a settled culture, and explained by officials who knew the vocabulary of herders and weavers. Law's empire preceded the armies. When cities opened their gates, they were not only admitting horsemen. They were letting in standards of weight, measures of cloth, rates of tax, and schedules of relief in famine years. Families began to travel from one end of the grass to the other without exchanging their calendar. The ordo remained the beating heart. Its economy resembled an organism able to feed itself while moving. Milk flows became payroll. Meat rations became morale. Silk bolts taken as tribute became salaries and bribes. The great cotton stood at the center of this circulation, tallying where the arteries thickened and where they threatened to clot. Burke treated the camp like a city that could never afford walls. She assigned the tent lines and kept the carts moving. She had an ear for complaints that would become mutinies a season from now if left unaddressed. When officers came to quarrel about rank, she made them sit until their anger cooled and then redistributed work rather than titles. Men left her presence with a task and without fuel for a feud. Through daughters, she braided the empire into itself. Marriages were not favors but contracts with enforcement mechanisms. A governor who married a royal daughter did not merely gain prestige. He acquired a supervisor. Those women ran their households with budgetary discipline and a feel for local weather. They learned which mosques, shrines, and temples anchored the town, which markets cheated foreigners, which quarter stored grain and which stored rumors. When rebellion threatened, wedding feasts turned into negotiation floors where terms were hammered out with the dignity of ceremony instead of the panic of siege, one marriage at a time. The frontiers turned into rooms of the same house. These rooms accepted different paints, some kept their languages, prayer times, and market days, but the house rules were unavoidable. Pay tax on time. Do not obstruct merchants. Respect envoys. Send your men when the banner is raised. Feed the poor in drought. Keep the roads clear. Punish theft publicly. Accept that the Khan, like a summer storm, may be present or absent without warning. Locals discovered that the rules, though demanding, delivered their part of the bargain. Trade spiked. Judges started judging rather than selling verdicts. The least important people learned to expect a kind of predictability that nomad empires were not supposed to supply. The Kurultai returned often, as governance required periodic breaths. On these occasions, the laws were recited like songs people could hum in their sleep. The assembly was not a rubber stamp. Elders who had bled for the tent did not hesitate to complain when local governors turned lazy. Captains asked for adjustments and penalties when a new situation, theft of courier horses, fraud in weighing tea bricks, demanded sharper edges. Temujin listened because he wanted the thing to last. He hated improvisation that announced itself as genius. His goal was to make decisions that would survive a drunk commander and a bad harvest. Tales spread of grim scenes that made the Yasa feel alive rather than painted. A city in the west executed envoys and sent their heads home as a dare. The answer came without delay. The gate that had looked like a mouth was broken like a jaw. The merchants were spared because merchants do more good living than dead. Officials who had ordered the outrage were made to count the bodies of their victims in front of their own families. The punishment was not only pain, it was pedagogy. Farther east, in a caravan town, soldiers caught an officer skimming the transport tax. Instead of a quiet beating, he was made to refund publicly with interest and give a cloak to each driver who had complained. Some thought this soft. The steppe understood that shame can educate longer than scars. The decimal system bled into civilian life. Tents arranged by tens made the camp's evenings feel safe. 10 households, shared a watch schedule. 10 groups of 10 handled fire control when a spark got loose on a windy night. 10 carts repaired a neighbor's axle in an afternoon when another winter threatened to break it. Small responsibilities multiplied until they became culture. Children raised inside this arithmetic learned not to expect a rescue from a hero. They expected a response from their 10 yam riders, lean men who lived between stations, became famous for arriving in snow with news no one believed could travel that far that fast. They wore the state the way a priest wears his vestments. When they spurred into a town square, markets paused. Good news, amnesty, tax relief, a festival day arrived as the kind of miracle that looks like competence. Bad news war on a frontier. Conscription orders arrived in the same hand but was accepted because everyone remembered. The last time the system saved them a week of waiting. When a courier was robbed, punishment whipped through the road network like wind through reeds. After a few examples, the roads became safer than city alleys. Temujin's relationship to religion is often summarized by the sentence that priests liked him. The longer truth is that he liked any institution that placed restraint above vanity. Mosques, shrines, and temples enjoyed protection as long as their stewards played by the market rules he enforced. Clerics who swore to protect the poor in famine years became the empire's best allies because the poor remembered. Those who tried to use their sanctuaries as vaults for thieves found themselves politely informed that the gods would understand a door being opened under official seal. The Yasa's tolerance was practical, but practicality raised to principle is indistinguishable from wisdom in daily life. Writing spread because the Yan demanded it. A ruler who once measured loyalty by how close a cousin's tent stood now measured it by the promptness of reply sketched in inks carried across the world. The Uyghur script folded Mongol vowels into straight lines and curves, and clerks trained to inscribe orders also began to list grain tallies, troop numbers, and the names of orphans to be fed at state kitchens. Knowledge that had once been a song in a grandmother's mouth turned into marks anyone could continue singing. In a culture suspicious of stone, writing became the thing that outlasted wind. None of this looked impressive from a distance. The reforms traveled on soup steam, hoofbeats, lists pinned to tent poles, and the gestures of women telling men where to pitch the next camp. Yet these homely movements made the empire a system attractive enough that its enemies sometimes surrendered for the convenience. A lord willing to trade his right to arbitrary cruelty for the right to sleep without imagining knives in the dark was a convert worth having. The Yasa converted more efficiently than any sermon because it touched daily life. It reduced surprises, and surprises are what kill. Bert's command of logistics deepened as the circle widened. She became the auditor everyone feared and trusted. She entered a governor's tent in a city far from the Ordo and knew in an hour whether the books would stand up to inspection because she asked the questions that women ask when deciding how much food to cook for a funeral. How many sacks? How many mouths? Who hasn't eaten meat in a week? Her view of justice was granular. Her view of danger was specific. Through her the state learned to see with kitchen eyes. Gold and silver dazzled men. She looked for the broken pot someone pretended not to see. The marriage diplomacy she coordinated moved daughters into households where they acted like governors without official titles. Their husbands learned that the empire arrived with them and that it came to stay. Cities that once cared only for the whims of a local aristocracy began caring about calendars. Ships started to leave on time because a princess's steward had discovered that wharf bosses showed up drunk after feast days. That detail could sound small until you realize that on the scale of a continent, a ship leaving on time is a victory. This mesh of law, drill, language, and household power produced something that rarely appears in histories of conquest: lightness. The empire began to feel portable. It could be rolled up in a morning and unrolled a week later on a different river with the same rules intact. Copper weights clinked the same in markets a month apart by road. An orphan recognized the ration officer's face in a town he had never visited. A widow found the same right to complain to a clerk wearing a hat she did not recognize. The structure was not beautiful. It was better. It was familiar. When the black standards rose and the war voice returned, soldiers rode out, knowing that whatever they made possible in the field would be legible at home. Their sisters would be paid. Their mothers would be heard. Their wives would not be arbitrarily claimed by men with better jewelry. Those promises are as good a weapon as iron. They kept the army from eating its own tail in victory, which is what kills most conquering peoples. The steppe had never seen a state built out of moving parts that fit this smoothly. It began as a whisper about a different way to live and hardened into expectation. Envoys carried the rumor. Merchants priced it into their ledgers. Rivals felt it when their cousins switched tents. The law did not stop the wind. It learned to ride it before armies point outward. The world points them. The grass had changed its mind for several seasons in a row, some years damp and generous, others bitten to the roots. When it rained well, foals grew into a moving harvest and every rider owned speed. When it failed, tempers did not wait for councils. Across the frontier, caravans stalled where local lords had planted toll posts like thorns. The great routes that once linked the forests of the north to the amber markets and the silk roads kinked at river crossings and city gates. Jerkin gin officials taxed in layers, local bandits cut their share, and governors skinned whatever survived. Merchants began traveling with storytellers because a good story could buy a narrow pass that coin could not. To people who had learned to count safety by how quickly they could move, this felt like suffocation. The question that kept surfacing in camp talk was simple: who can make tomorrow less random? Temujin had an answer the steppe had not heard at scale: law rides faster than luck. The Yasa had transformed his tents into a place where food and judgment arrived on time. The relay posts ran like arteries under skin. He wasn't offering comfort. He was offering a schedule. When men from far bands came to weigh the new order, they didn't ask about glory. They asked about grain, winter pasture, and whether their girls would be granted the same protections as the wives of famous captains. He said yes and punished his cousins when they forgot. With that, the ceiling that had pressed nomads down for a century cracked. A leader promising a map instead of a miracle is a rare thing on dirt roads. If a house can keep its own roof on, it is allowed to look across the fence. The Jin dynasty to the southeast had been dominant long enough to forget what dominance costs. Their armies were heavy with armor and ritual. They had cities that could outlast famine and fields that could feed sieges. But they trusted walls with the complacency of people who sleep inside them. The Mongols didn't bring a theory of civilization to the border. They brought a guarantee: if you surrender, you will live to collect taxes again. If you resist, the wall will remember how easily stone can be unstacked. The first campaigning seasons against the Jin look, on paper, like accidents of weather exploited by fast horses. In practice, they were patient engineering. The Mongol army taught itself to be a siege train. Chinese and Khitan defectors, Muslim artisans drawn from Central Asian outposts, and Uyghur scribes brought techniques Temujin absorbed without pride. Battering rams grew skins of wet rawhide against fire. Stone throwers multiplied and learned to lob gunpowder bombs that screamed as they fell. When a city's gatehouse stood like a shrugging giant, miners were paid to tunnel under it and let gravity make an argument. Frozen rivers turned into roads so wide even the cautious rode with spurs in. Winter, formerly the steppes' tyrant, converted itself into a bridge. He didn't throw himself at the largest fortresses early. He trimmed the edges, cutting granaries, capturing fords, and making loyal towns into audition stages. He sent envoys with promises that were both generous and exact. Open your gate, release the hostages in your dungeons, hand over the corrupt tax keeper you all hate, and your people will be counted, not culled. Kill the envoys, and the deal becomes arithmetic of another kind. Letters addressed to officials use the same tone as commands to his own captains: precise, spare, patient once, unforgiving after. When towns took the offer, he placed a darogachi to oversee taxes and left the local elites at their desks. People kept their rituals and their kitchens. He kept the road for those who said no and laughed at horsemen who had to learn the difference between a pulley and a prayer. Terror was a lesson plan. The Mongols did not invent atrocity, and they weren't the only ones who practiced it. What set them apart was management. They didn't slaughter to feel strong. They slaughtered to reduce their expenses next spring. A city that shut its gate after being offered terms turned itself into a public ceremony, the first day for terror, the next for reinstating markets, the third for household registration. Every spared artisan told his cousins. Every dead magistrate warned his peers. The performance traveled farther than scouts. Intelligence moved inside this system like blood. Traders served as weather vanes. Pilgrims reported which monasteries fed the poor information that predicted where a town would resist longest. Captured scribes were given a better post in a different county and told to send news as if they had fallen in love with their new boss. Defectors were questioned not only about troop strength but about river currents, millstones, and which gate captain liked to drink before his watch. Yam riders updated the center with a speed that made revenge workable without rage. A caravan slaughtered meant envoys sent, then a punitive column, then a governor pulled out of office by the collar and delivered to the people he had stolen from. The aim wasn't storm and fury. It was a public record of cause and effect that anyone could recite. The northern China campaigns sharpened this machine. When Temujin's forces approached Zhengdu, the Jin capital, there were months of surrounding not as a circle but as a set of reasons. Enemy armies were lured out to be erased in flat fields where feigned retreats stretched their lines until they snapped. The city learned to expect the unexpected trenches appearing where there had been open ground, siege platforms rising as if grown from the soil, towers wrapped in hides inching forward under sparks and stones. Farmer boys drafted in a panic peered over battlements to see horsemen, who only a decade earlier could not have imagined reading the geometry of walls. The palace understood too late that the steppe had hired its own teachers. Inside the Mongol camp, the law kept soldiers from turning hunger into indiscipline. Punishments for looting before the walls fell were as real as the rewards that would follow if they waited. Officers who had once thought bravery and greed identical learned to separate them. Families far away received food and blankets during long sieges because Bert's supply chain measured victory by how many men returned able to ride another month. Discipline was not a virtue. It was a technology that allowed the siege engines to keep throwing. Jiangdu surrendered under the weight of engineers and a calendar. The Mongols did not stumble inward stunned by their success. They followed a checklist. Guard the granaries. Post notices that merchants could work. Summon clerics to resume services. Identify the handful of people to punish publicly and make the rest of the city feel relief that the list was short. Even where they allowed a sack, Temujin made sure it had an end. Chaos that doesn't stop is rebellion under another name, revenge, which had begun as a husband's vow beside a collapsed tent, hardened here into policy that punished arrogance and duplicity because they were expensive. A governor who took bribes to starve a region received the same attention as a general who killed an envoy. An official who used famine to acquire land from desperate families learned that correspondence traveled faster than corruption. The steppe's old habit of calling violence custom became a liability when faced with a ruler who named it theft. In this sense, his empire began to move beyond the pulse of raids. It learned to treat moral language as a budget. People who surrendered weren't asked to applaud. They were asked to behave. Temujin offered terms that bordered on startling for the age, taxes fixed low enough to be calculable. Road protection for a fee less than what had been stolen from them in a good month of banditry. Religious freedom because temples that fed the poor made cities easier to govern. And the right to keep familiar faces in office so long as those faces posted results. That bargain grew in power because it valued continuity. Conquerors often parade new men into every office and replace a timetable that worked badly with one that doesn't function at all. Temujin placed overseers who cared about the work, not the stage dot to keep that bargain believable. His army did something strange to veterans of border wars. It moved away quickly once a city was folded into the ledger. Garrisons were small, sometimes nothing more than a detachment of clerks, a few cavalry, and a man who kept keys. The yamposts became more visible than soldiers. Travelers who had come to expecting bribes found the state selling them official papers that worked. Caravans that had learned to pad travel time for theft stopped padding. Word of mouth turned into a roadmap. None of this made the campaigns easy. Sieges drained men and horses. Floods ruined weeks of work in a night. Sometimes the enemy adopted Mongol tricks faster than Mongols learned new ones. On one river, the defenders chained floating rafts together and set them ablaze. The current carried the fire into the siege lines, and the army learned that wind direction belongs on the day's orders as much as an assault time. Temujin adapted. He didn't romanticize surprise. He memorized it and canceled it next week. Opponents relied on pride. They told themselves that horse archers cannot push a wall. They told themselves that winter will make the northerners' fingers too slow to tie knots. They told themselves that the capital's name was a kind of spell, that self-regard is a kind of intoxicant. It makes a person forget to count his arrows before he cheers. Temujin built his myth in the opposite direction, a quiet theater where the law did the terrifying part. Guards at the gatehouses started whispering the arithmetic. If we open, the market returns. If we don't, the city pays the cost for a governor's courage. That whisper pried more hinges than any ramdot as the front moved south and west. The political philosophy underlying the campaigns clarified itself. Humility would be rewarded because it was cheap, and vanity would be punished because it forced him to spend blood. He put this into letters to governors who had never seen his face. The language was steady. Your people want a schedule. I will provide one. If you make me knock, the price goes up. Some rulers accepted the math. Others discovered that dying for spectacle did not impress their widows. When a city fell without a fight, the tax rate did not bite. Merchants were not gouged. And the Doragachi who collected levies was expected to send reports that matched the market's gossip. If the sums disagreed, he was replaced. When a city fell after a long resistance, the ratchet turned. A proportion of its ruling class disappeared, and closeted abuses saw light. The blanket of law covered the people, but not those who had been feeding on them. Over time, this trained the empire's temperament. Subjects learned to fear their own elites more than the cavalry on the horizon. Elites learned to keep the roads smooth if they wished to remain elites. Nothing about this made Temujin a modern liberal. He enforced through fear when he thought it necessary and used mercy as a scalpel. Yet the philosophy of power he practiced had more in common with good accounting than with poetry. He asked a city what it needed to be calm and provided it in exchange for obedience. He praised men who solved problems without asking for banners to wave. He sidelined nobles who needed every favor to arrive with a trumpet. Where other conquerors escalated every victory into a bigger spectacle, he escalated system capacity, more posts, better clerks. New siege parts taken on the road for the next stubborn gate got at night, in camps that smelled of wet leather and ash. Letters were drafted to governors farther down the road. They all said versions of the same thing. I will be in your sight before your couriers reach me. This was not boasting. It was logistics. The yam made it almost true. The discipline of the decimal army made sure that when couriers arrived with requests, someone was ready to answer with a unit that could actually move. The why now? That had started the season, the weather's moodiness, the choke points on the trade roads, the longing of common people to stop guessing, met a leader whose promise was not charismatic chaos but routine. That routine, once it acquired siege towers and gunpowder jars, proved more dangerous than any charge across a meadow. It didn't depend on a single victory. It depended on replication. City after city, the Mongol bargain repeated itself. Low taxes, safe roads, local faces under new supervision. Religious tolerance as long as priests fed mouths and kept knives off the altar. Protection for anyone carrying the right stamped tablet. And the guarantee that the rules this week would be the rules next week unless you broke them. The campaigns against the Kians Jin taught the empire something essential about itself. It did not need to be loved to be chosen. It only needed to work. Villagers who had lived through 3 corrupt governors in a row and a dozen bandit seasons in between looked at the men on small shaggy horses and decided that a stranger who raises bread prices only when the harvest is late is preferable to an uncle who raises them because he can. That is what it means to break a ceiling. You change what people think is possible by changing what they can rely on. From that point forward, every frontier he approached, with Khwarezm later, with the steppe kingdoms, with fortified river towns, met the same philosophy disguised differently. Make the world predictable where you can. Remove men who sell unpredictability as honor. Punish deceit because it multiplies costs. And keep moving because stasis invites nostalgia for chaos. The steppe had taught him how to survive. The Jin campaigns taught him how to govern strangers. Conquest was still war, but its true weapon was a calendar that arrived on time. The plain chosen for the assembly looked like a shallow bowl laid in grass. Streams braided through it, willow fringes flickering in the wind, and the horizon ran unbroken in every direction, as if the sky had come down to watch. Tents arrived first in careful files, then herds, then the lines of riders whose banners were still held vertical as lances. Messengers moved in quiet arcs, checking where fires should be dug and which clan would sit facing the morning. A low murmur built not the uproar of a market, but the contained hum of people waiting for the name of a season to be spoken. A Kureltai is less a vote than a weather change. Elders stepped forward with felt hats tucked under their arms and recited who had helped whom, which wrongs had been righted, and why today could not be spent arguing about yesterday. Captain spoke next, short and practical, how grain had been distributed, which roads now ran safely, what the winter had done to the foals. The singer's turn came, and the song folded memory into a rope everyone could pull. When Temujin entered the circle, he didn't stand on a platform. 4 men lifted a white felt rug and set him upon it at shoulder height. In the step that is not a monarch's pose, it is a physical reminder. Many backs bear the weight. Ritual details mattered. 9 white yak-tails stood upright for good fortune. The black horsehair standard hung rolled, the way a storm waits behind the next valley. A bowl of fermented mare's milk passed. Drops were flicked to the 4 quarters, and another to the vault of the sky, a courtesy to the blue heaven that watches all oaths. Shamans beat slow drums, not to drown the human voice, but to set it walking evenly. Temujin spoke without embroidery. He named what needed naming: the harvest, the mail routes, the law, the old habit of raiding inside the camp that would stop today. When the final question left his mouth, "Do you carry this with me?" the answer was not shouted. It moved through bodies as a wave. Men and women stood, hands to their chests. Agreement on the step is sound and posture at once. The title they placed on him, Genghis, puzzled even those who used it. Some heard oceanic, some firm, some iron hard. He did not pause to define it. A name gains meaning by the work it orders. Oaths followed in a sequence that revealed priorities. First, obedience to the code that had held the tents together when the horses were thin. Second, protection of envoys and traders, for without them the roads starve. Third, penalties for theft inside the order, so that the strongest learn to fear their own hands. Fourth, summons to serve when called, no excuses resting on old genealogies. The crowd repeated these lines, not as poetry, but as instructions compact enough to travel in the mouth. Authority by acclamation needs a symbol to make it portable. The order-moving capital, marketplace, court already carried its own silhouette of wagons and felt. Now it acquired a vocabulary of signs that changed a leader into an institution. Bronze tablets stamped with the Khan's mark hung from couriers' belts. Merchants carried wooden passports carved thin as knife blades. Seals impressed on messages used a script that had entered the tents from settled neighbors. Banners with horsehair tails stood where law was being spoken. When they shifted to black and unrolled, everyone inside understood that words would be backed by iron. The ideas hammered at previous gatherings were repeated and fastened. Fair tax and punishments weighed the same. Religious practice would be left to conscience, but shrines and temples would be expected to feed the hungry in lean years the way chiefs once fed their followers. Governors who cheated would be judged where the people could see. Murder of envoys voided negotiation everywhere the Khan's riders could reach. None of this was new to those who had been living under those rules. What changed at the Kurultai was scale. The promises announced to cousins now extended to strangers who had never said Temujin's name. Ceremony slid into administration as smoothly as a saddle fits a back. Officers marked tent lanes with stakes, so the order of march tomorrow would not become a fight tonight. Scribes in stitched leather sat behind a curtain, copying appointments onto small slats. A register of the families that had come, who had lost a son, who needed extra fodder, was read out, not for performance, but because the new government wanted witnesses for its memory. The Ordo was not pretending to be a palace. It was teaching everyone watching how decisions would be made for the rest of their lives. While the men counted spears and planned patrols, another form of statecraft unfolded among the cartwheels. Bert and the senior women moved like compasses through the crowd, checking who had eaten, who looked sullen, where disappointment might harden into grievance. They were not comforting. They were diagnosing. Allah's first enemies are hurt pride and empty pots. The great Kata knew both could be treated by action quickly taken under the excuse of ceremony. A bag of flour here, an apology there, a reassignment of grazing rights announced as if it had been decided last month. The empire was born with a quiet mood, fix things before the rumor. Finishes forming. The most durable decisions that day were marriages. Daughters were not given away like chattel. They were sent to the frontiers as living ligaments. A union with a frontier ruler turned his camp into a branch office of the court. Husbands gained honor and proximity. The new wives brought attendants who knew the dispatch codes, the tax rates, the temper of the law. When a postal station failed or a bridge collapsed, the report came from a woman's tent because her people swept the market every morning and heard complaints before officials filed them. In the language of the empire, son-in-law became another title for provincial governor. These women governed without seal rings. They controlled supply lists, dismissed lazy bailiffs, and manufactured loyalty by scheduling the small festivities that tell a town it hasn't been forgotten. They held court sitting cross-legged in an awning shade, with scribes to either side and a barrel of grain set where failing petitioners could be fed. When a husband sulked because a decision humiliated him, the princess solved the problem with a gesture that saved his face and did not wreck the policy. This is called endurance in households and wisdom in states. Temujin's sons would carry armies outward. His daughters would hold what those armies attached to the core. This distribution of labor was not ideology. It was recognition of strength. Women had been keeping families alive in wind and hunger for a lifetime. Empire asked for the same skill at scale. A daughter married to a lord received a quiver. But her most important equipment was a ledger and a sense, for which lie would rot into rebellion if allowed to spread unchecked. The newly named Khan understood the need to turn a coalition into a brand. What he offered could be summarized in 2 rows of words that even a caravan guard could repeat to a gate captain. Rules you can predict. Punishment you can believe. Other rulers had cultivated devotion. He wanted radical confidence and procedure. The system did not ask to be loved. It asked to be trusted. And trust grew from repetition. Tax on schedule. Road patrol on schedule. Judgment on schedule. Mercy, when granted, explained so that others could learn what to expect. Towns that submitted early discovered that this predictability freed energy. Markets revived because every shopkeeper knew which official would be collecting and how much. Clerics returned to their services because no one demanded that they change their prayers. Only that they stop hiding crooks behind altars. The ceremony acknowledged heaven because people need more than law to hold them together. Shamans tied blue silk to lances, a nod to the endless sky whose goodwill no one wished to test. But the cosmology that really mattered was here on Earth. The Khanate proposed a practical bargain. The world was not fair, but it could be made consistent. The gods could be thanked. The yam would deliver messages. The code would punish bribe takers. The soldiers would continue to behave because their wives would notice if they didn't and tell the chained and tell the tale. Captain within the hour, envoys fanned outward within days. They carried slats stamped with the new seal and instructions, written out in clear script. Keep your officials if you can keep order. If you cannot, a replacement will arrive with the next caravan. Your tax rate is this. Your merchants may travel under this tablet without being robbed. Bring your disputes to the governor's tent before you bring them to the fields with knives. Many cities did not need threats. They needed the permission structure to act. Local elites who were tired of their cousins stopped their cousins by pointing to the tablet. Not my command, the Khan's rule. Authority borrowed in this way freed men from losing face. The empire grew each time a small town found the courage to say no to an old bully dot in the weeks after the Kurultai. The power centers of the realm learned what Genghis meant in practice. Shoes wore out on inspectors' feet. Small abuses that create big anger were addressed. Postal stations were refilled with grain and hay after a winter that had emptied them. A city mayor who had taxed flour at a crisis price returned what he had taken, bowl by bowl, while a clerk called the names. The gesture stuck in memory more firmly than any edict. It said the universe had a memory too, and for ordinary people that was religion enough. Notable visitors arrived. Chiefs who had refused to come at first rode in with sons and doubts. The great captain met their wives and took them through the kitchens rather than the councils. She had them taste the milk, see the accounts, and meet the women who tracked which households hadn't received their grain. In an hour, they understood how the system felt from inside. Many never returned to the old way because the new one removed the daily humiliation of begging a lazy man for what was already owed. Genghis Khan's own speech after the lifting on felt was short. He promised no golden age. He said only that people would eat what they earned, that roads would be watched, that envoys would be safe, and that he would spend his strength making sure decisions were not made in secret. "The plain is wide," he said, pointing outward. "We can all ride on it if we don't trample each other." The line was not memorable to poets, but to merchants and mothers it sounded like a roof. The new government demonstrated its teeth before the crowd dispersed. A group of men had tried to sell protected travelers counterfeit tablets with the new seal. They were brought before the banners. The evidence was displayed. The penalty dealt without ceremony and without cruelty was removal from the protection of the law. They had tried to counterfeit. They were expelled from the Ordo and marked so other camps would know them. A different case followed. A captain who had struck a woman during a quarrel. He lost a month's share and his position. Punishments were not savage. They were visible. That visibility created an education too strong to ignore. In the evenings after the rituals, the tents hummed with planning. Captains mapped next year's campaigns using the new relay stations as stepping stones. Scribes drafted letters of appointment for the provinces that had submitted, and prepared different letters for those that had not, each carrying a tone calibrated to what had been learned about their pride. The women reorganized the Ordo so the marching order mirrored the chain of command. A soldier could find his officer in a dust storm by riding where the officer's cart would be. The empire was not a gift of the sky. It was a posture the whole camp had learned to hold. If a hinge has a feeling, the step felt it that week. The world that measured a leader by the distance of his ancestors' bones from heaven had yielded a little to a world that measured him by the distance between promise and delivery. The black standards rolled, then unfurled when they needed to. The white standards lifted again when petitions were heard. Merchants tested the new road rules and discovered that a stamped tablet safely crossed places where it once invited robbery. Clerics resumed prayers with a light touch. No one checked their words. And in towns that had never seen the grasslands, men began to say Genghis when they meant fair enforcement. The coronation ended without fireworks. Families loaded carts. Herds drifted back to pasture. The ring of tents opened into a road. The new Khan sat his horse as he always had, rough cloak at his shoulders, eyes narrowed against the wind. If you came from far away and expected trumpets, you might have been disappointed. But if you listened for the sound, that means a state has begun, routines taking hold. People repeating rules without being forced. Travelers planning journeys they would have avoided yesterday. You could hear it across the plain. A storm had been named, and instead of tearing the world down, it had decided, for now, to keep it in order. The spark arrived wrapped in trade cloth. A caravan bearing the Khan's stamped tablets drifted into Otrar, a frontier city in the Khwarezmian realm where the Sir Daria River bends between reeds and brick. Merchants unloaded bolts of silk, ingots of silver, bundles of fur, and sealed letters requesting safe passage. The governor smelled espionage where there was profit. Greed and paranoia shook hands. He seized the goods, imprisoned the traders, and sent word to his ruler, Shah Muhammad, that spies had been caught posing as merchants. The Shah's council, proud and suspicious of neighbors they considered barbarians in good boots, let the governor decide the next move. The prisoners were killed, beards cut, heads displayed. The state excused itself with the familiar story. We were only protecting ourselves. Temujin's answer began with paper, not with steel. He sent envoys, a Muslim, a Mongol, and a Turk to demand justice. The governor punished, the goods repaid, the road reopened. The Shah returned the Mongol with his beard shorn, a deliberate insult. The others did not return at all. An envoy is not a soldier. He travels under a treaty older than cities. To break that custom is to declare you intend to live outside the calendar of civilized risk. Temujin called his captains. "They have killed our words," he said. "Then we will answer with deeds they can hear." The war that followed did not look like rage. It looked like a chess game played by a river and a desert at once. The Shah presided over a sprawling empire with garrison towns that glowed like coals along waterways. Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, Merv. He outnumbered the invaders on paper. He possessed fortresses, courts, irrigation, and tax ledgers fat as winter wolves. Temujin possessed a machine for turning distance into advantage. The decimal army moved in separate teeth that could bite together without chewing one another. His commanders Jib, Sabatai, Joki, Jagatai, Gedai, Tolui were less ornaments than instruments, each used for the problem that suited him. Scouts had ridden Khorazm for months disguised as camel drivers. Scribes had sketched gatehouses and counted towers. Chinese engineers traveled with the army, accustomed to solving stone with wood and leverage. The Yam carried messages as if the road itself had flesh. They crossed the Jaxartes as winter sealed it, skating hooves over ice that cracked but did not give way. On the far bank they split, not because unity was weak, but because multiple threats paralyze better than one large one. Joki and Jagatai screened Otrar to keep its garrison penned in while Gedei tightened the noose. Jib and Sabutai took their brigades deep into the Kaizokam, dragging water in leather sacks, riding at night, chasing dust that betrayed fleeing columns. Temujin pointed the main weight where pride would force the Shah to look toward Bukhara and Samarkand. He wanted the enemy ruler to see him everywhere and nowhere, a rumor with hooves. Otrar received its own arithmetic. The city held out longer than its governor deserved. When the walls finally broke, the Mongols captured the man who had started the fire. He was executed, not ritualistically, not with a prolonged sermon, but with the crisp certainty of a ledger finally balancing. The garrison, mostly mercenaries and terrified conscripts, was scattered to labor or to home. Artisans were counted and set aside. The order of operations, punish originators, spare skill, wasn't mercy. It was harvest. The approach to Bukhara revealed something rarer than Ayan: brutality, theater designed to collapse decision-making. Jib's screen flitted around the city like a lizard's shadow. Refugees poured in with stories of demon horsemen who could ride for days without water and appear where logic said no road lived. Gates shut. In councils, older men advised negotiation. Younger men advised displays of nerve. The Khan appeared outside the northern wall before any argument had matured. When he entered, it was not with a victory parade. It was with a plan for tomorrow. He rode straight to the main mosque at the hour of prayer, dismounted, and climbed the pulpit. The message, delivered in careful translation, cut in two directions at once. Your leaders have failed you. There will be order. Those who resist will be erased. Those who serve will be paid. He did not need the famous line later chroniclers attached to that scene. The point was to let a city hear a voice that sounded like inevitability. Samarkand's prestige made it slower to capitulate. The Shah's field armies assembled and were peeled away by feigned retreats that stretched their lines into threads. The Mongols practiced this maneuver the way scribes practice characters often enough to write it under pressure. Chinese siege parts rolled forward traction trebuchets powered by teams of men hauling ropes, protected by hide screens that hissed when oil fired from the walls tried to lick them. Moats were filled with bundles of reeds. Towers were built inside the shadow of the walls. The defenders watched horsemen do the work of carpenters and realized they were fighting a new animal altogether. When Samarkand fell, the conquerors went to work quick as bureaucrats. Registers, assignments, protection for merchants, identification of the corrupt, resettlement lists. A city decapitated of its dumbest pride can be made to stand upright if the legs are spared. The Khan spared legs. Nishapur became a darker lesson. A Mongol commander was killed in the struggle there, and grief amplified discipline into ferocity. Tolui oversaw the aftermath with that cold competence for which he was both respected and feared. The city's resistance costed its ruling class, and by many accounts, a horrifying number of others. Nothing prettifies such scenes. The empire's logic defended itself with two arguments. What resists consumes lives now and more tomorrow. What submits feeds them. The policy was consistent, the way winter is consistent. The chase for Shah Muhammad turned into a story that would have been a comedy if it had not left so many dead. Jeeb and Subutai pursued him west through deserts and broken country, across the Oxus Amu Darya, through towns that locked gates at his approach instead of the Mongols, through villages that discovered too late that a fleeing monarch asks for more than a conquering general. The Shah crossed the Caspian on a boat with dignity clinging to him like an ill-fitting cloak and died on an island, worn down by the same weather he had thought to rule. His son Jalal Din inherited courage but not a kingdom. He fought brilliantly where the terrain allowed, inflicted pain, then threw himself into the Indus to escape capture. Temujin, watching from a height, allowed admiration to travel ahead of his next order. Even emperors enjoy a clean exit. The propaganda war rode with the army. Prisoners were sometimes released with food and instructions to carry a message home. Open the gate and live. Instead of piling skulls at every town, the conquerors chose places for spectacle and places for reprieve. Rumors exaggerated both. A merchant spared at Bukhara told a cousin in Herat that taxes had dropped and thieves had vanished. A woman who had watched a magistrate flogged for extortion in Merv told her sister in another city that the new people made her feel less despised. Even those who hated the invaders began to keep a second set of accounts. Here is what they broke. Here is what they fixed. That double column is how empires root themselves. Mobility made the war look supernatural. A Mongol warrior rode with 3 to 4 remounts. When the animal beneath him blew hard, he slipped to a fresh back as easily as a craftsman changes tools. The string of horses ate the world faster. Where a conventional army marched with wagons full of food, an arav of herders moved with milk that renewed itself daily. In winter, horses ate dry reeds and thin hay cached by scouts the month before. In summer, they grazed at night while men slept. A campaign that others would have suspended in snow accelerated instead. Rivers and frieze became roads. Officers planned around ice the way Roman generals had planned around bridges. Mobility did not merely outrun enemies. It outran surprise. This speed partnered with an intelligence system that worked like an immune response. A patrol that encountered unexpected resistance did not die seeking glory. It rode away and sent a courier. The response arrived wrapped in law. A governor who protected the attackers learned what expulsion felt like when the empire withdrew protection from his entire district. Nomads had learned across centuries to endure losses by telling themselves that weather had decided. Now someone else decided, and he remembered names. Justice at this scale started to look like a filing system. Khwarazm cities experienced the policy in waves. Bukhara's artisans were shipped east to build. Samarkand's weavers were moved in groups large enough to keep their skills, not as isolated trophies doomed to forget how their hands worked. Blacksmiths were paid whether they had loved the former state or not. A conquered countryside fed new construction sites far away because the yam permitted managers to calculate demand instead of estimating it by guessing the mood of the gods. Roads reopened with guards who were paid on time. And behind that efficiency loped the knowledge that a city which killed an envoy or murdered surrendered troops would buy the same pageant of ruin Otrar had purchased. People whose families scraped by on market days, not on pride days, learned to treat the Khan's name as a weather forecast. He was not their friend. He was predictability with teeth. The rhetoric inside HQ remained crisp. Temujin told his sons and captains that they were not punishing sinners. They were punishing expense. A region that cheated merchants forced the empire to send riders. A city that rebelled after surrender forced the empire to divert engineers. Both costs were real. By naming them, he taught his people to see the campaign as accounting rather than a holy war. This did not absolve him. It explained him, which is all many subjects wanted. What do such victories look like up close? They look like the breath of a horse in freezing air turned briefly into a ribbon. They look like a dog running with a line of meat in its mouth, chased by a boy who has not eaten anything that moved in a month. They look like a mother at a roadside well deciding whether to step toward the new officer and ask for a ration, because yesterday someone told her widows were being counted. They look like a scribal clerk scratching a family's name onto a list. That will allow them to move through 2 provinces without being taxed twice. They look like a city gate as it opens, and the collective exhale of people who hoped that rumors about law were not lies. Was it vengeance? From the day the caravan died at Otrar, every step west could be described that way. The envoys killed. The governor mocked. The law spat upon. Revenge, if you define it as the restoration of injury to its sender, never left the saddle.
But revenge changed shape. It turned from a knife into a table where punishment was a place setting alongside rewards for anyone who sat down politely. Where a child begged, a ration officer wrote a number rather than time, a speech about the Khan's greatness. Where a city opened its door, a darugachi asked for weight standards, not applause. That transformation heat, turning into policy, made a world fire more than revenge. It made it a system. The campaign ran west until maps scrambled names. Nishapur burned and later rebuilt. Merv learned the quiet that follows when a brutal town administration has been mowed. Herat rebalanced under new tax rules. Bulk went on selling carpets to people who liked to count coins. Jeeb and Subotai crossed the Caucasus, fought Georgian and Kipchak wars, probed for the physics of Europe. They outran their own supply lines on purpose because speed replaced supply. They fought a coalition on the Kharkar one, and then rode away across the steppe to reappear thousands of kilometers later where no one expected them for another year. The rumor of their hoofbeats crossed faster than they did. Kings far from Khwarezm began to adjust policies because of what their cousins whispered in letters. Inside the empire, logistics grew sophisticated enough to be boring. That is how citizens learned to breathe again. Yam stations stored oats and hay in quantities that scribes could predict. Remount herds were counted with marks that matched the scribes' tablets. Farriers worked on schedules. Engineers kept a stock of hinges, iron pins, and sling stones sized to the traction machines. Women at the auto-planned distaff campaigns. Food and clothing moved to points that would need them a month from now. Temujin's mind kept the shape of the night Bert was stolen. But his governance replaced panic with inventory. If you ask a jurist whether justice and vengeance differ, he will give you a distinction useful in court. If you ask a mother in Bukhara, whose son was drafted twice by corrupt officials and then returned home under the new order with his share of plunder and 2 extra horses, she will tell you that justice is what made her family's tomorrow predictable. Yet graves did not stop appearing because rulers learned to count. Cities eroded, memory halved the stories, and a new set of elites learned how to exploit the machinery of predictability for their own small dynasties. Grand systems have no more innocence than the men who run them. When the campaign against Khwarezm settled into administration, the Khan's people performed their final act of psychological warfare against the living and the dead. In front of city gates, now loyal envoys reenacted the murder at Otranot with bodies, but with their tablets held high. Then they recited the clause carved into the law: those who touch messengers touch the Khan's hand. Crowds nodded, not in reverence but with the relief. That comes when the rules can be repeated without being laughed at. The war had delivered its point. A frontier governor's arrogance had been answered on a scale that taught other governors to study the price list. A monarch's vanity had sent him into exile. His courage had been acknowledged without erasing the fact that he had bet badly with other people's lives. A world that stole caravans for sport discovered that caravans now moved armed with mathematics. The question the empire left in its wake was the one that now stalked its sleep. If fairness is enforced by flames, who decides where enforcement ends and revenge begins? The law shrugged. It was written to ride, not to philosophize. The mothers who counted grain for winter had a sterner answer. Our children's next bowl weighs more than the word we use to describe how it got here. History, recording both answers, rode along. The map that mattered most did not hang on a wall. It sat on carpets inside the ordo, drawn in relationships instead of rivers, stitched with marriage cords instead of roads. When the armies paused, the empire breathed through households, tents that doubled as treasuries, kitchens that operated like ministries, and a family whose quarrels and affections arranged the world. Temujin's sons were posted, like pillars around the expanding circle. Joki rode west into the open ranges beyond the Sea of Daria, where the wind had room to forget names. He was eldest by recognition, if not by silence. The calendar of his birth travelled with him like a second shadow. He governed without grandstanding, preferring to bring skittish clans into orbit by bargaining rather than breaking. Hunters and herders liked his patience. From his camps along the lower Volga, he wrote letters that asked for clear lines. How far could he widen winter pasture? How much authority could he exercise when frontier nobles turned slow and stubborn? He signed every message as a son before he signed as a commander. Chagatai took the central, riverlands Transoxiana and the corridors of cities whose orchards perfume entire valleys for a month each year. He admired law more than charm. The yasa fit him like scale fits a fish. Courtrooms in Bukhara and Samarkand found a judge who expected everyone to stand before rules the way they stand before sunrise. Petitioners who tried to tug favors out of old genealogies met a wall. Soldiers liked him in battle because orders made sense. Merchants feared his audits because he counted to the last coin. He did not forget slights. He did not forget anything. Gadai remained nearest the core and muscled the system into rhythm. He absorbed the temper of the ordo, moderated disputes until they cooled, and invested more energy in making the machine run than in making his own legend. Where other brothers hardened into an idea, he softened into a habit. Men who dealt with him discovered that compromise could be a form of strength because it kept caravans moving. Temujin trusted him with the paperwork of conquest appointments, station mark, grain requisitions because he finished tasks without turning them into theatre. Tolui oversaw Mongolia proper and the northern front against the Jin, where pines crack in winter with a sound like breaking glass. He carried the empire's harshness with a steadiness that frightened enemies and reassured friends. He could be tender with his children and implacable with a city. When the law needed teeth, Tolui was the jaw. Between these four, a crack ran like a hidden stream. Joki's birth rumor, never named in public again, yet alive under every conversation about succession. Chagatai's exactness kept the rumor polished. Joki's reserve kept it from dying. The quarrel rarely erupted in front of soldiers. It simmered in phrasing how a captain acknowledged a command, where a brother stood at council and in the length of the pauses. Inside letters, Temujin faced the old problem of every founder. Choose the son who can hold the tent when the wind rises. He chose Gadai for the middle path he walked by instinct. The choice disappointed Chagatai's certainty and undercut Joki's claim without humiliating either. It also preserved the empire's temperament. A leader who steadied arguments was more useful than one who sharpened them. Tolui, who could have pressed his own case, became the quietest advocate for the decision. The drama of succession, our most common reason for civil war, was postponed by the logic of a household that had learned to eat before it celebrated. If the sons held the rim, the daughters tied the provinces to the hub. Alakai went to the Ongud, guarding the passes of the North Chinese frontier, and within a season her tent had turned that rough district into a relay of decrees, fodder, and news. Yugan moved north into the forest edge and learned the language of people who count winter in wolf prints. Al, Alton, and Tumalin were married into clans whose pride needed a bride that could smile and revoke attacks in the same hour. Each princess traveled with a caravan that looked like a small government: scribes, midwives, accountants, grooms, and a handful of soldiers who knew how to say no without unsheathing steel. Their authority arrived in domestic shapes. They kept ledgers of grain and of grievances. They opened storehouses without waiting for permission when floods pinched a valley. They heard petitions that husbands would have treated as irritation. They summoned Darugachi to explain why a road wasn't repaired and sent the man away with a fixed date instead of a lecture. When a governor sulked at correction, a daughter announced a festival and let the town sing until pride remembered how to laugh. Some rules: no killing envoys, no cheating markets, no extra taxes were non-negotiable. Everything else offered room to negotiate face-saving exits. In this way, imperial marriage became an instrument for cooling crises faster than armies could march. The arteries feeding this family state were audible. Along the Yam, horse bells and courier clatter stitched camps to cities. Post houses grew into small universes of reliability, fodder stacked under awnings, water barrels brimming, spare saddles hung in order, stallions ready to be saddled by a station master who knew the name on your paisy before you took it from your belt. A bronze pass stamped with the Khan's emblem could pull a fresh mount from a tired village without bargaining. The penalty for harming a rider was heavy enough that even thieves turned their heads. Messengers rode under a protection older than borders and stronger than fear. Merchants began to calculate time differently. A journey that once required a prayer for luck and a sack of bribe money now required paperwork and an expected arrival date. Caravans learned the value of efficiency: less weight wasted on guards because the road itself had become one. Partnerships formed between Mongol elites and Muslim traders. The autoed pooling capital and risk. Security shaved days off travel that they converted into profit. That profit convinced mayors to keep streets swept and bridges usable. The outline of what later chroniclers would call the Pax Mongolica wrote itself without a manifesto. Inclusivity sustained this quiet revolution. Yuga scribes lent the court the characters that could make a spoken order survive a Kenyan and a month. The Khitan statesman, Yaluchikai scholar, fiscal reformer, argued against killing cities and for counting them. His council convinced the Khan to take taxes lightly instead of conflating empire with plunder. Persian administrators such as Mahmud-Yevlak set up registers and courts in the west that locals respected because verdicts arrived on schedule and bribes carried penalties. Chinese engineers, whose tools had once argued with Mongol pride, now taught sieged geometry to men who wielded it like grammar. Syrian and Persian doctors entered the Ordo and learned to medicate along the road. An empire that trusted only natives would have collapsed under its own ignorance. Temujin hired people who knew better and expected them to be loyal to function. This fusion wasn't a costume, it was an operating system. Metric weights standardized at market stalls saved days of quarrel. Writing moved from a specialist's art to a tool sergeant's expected. Court translators turned arguments into agreements instead of into fistfights. Local faiths were left intact with a requirement attached: keep the poor alive. Shrines and mosques that fed in lean years became the safest treasuries. Priests who hid criminals were surprised to discover that the law touched altars too. The point was not to humiliate. It was to make sanctuary mean what it had claimed. Inside the Ordo, the shape of power remained domestic even as tents multiplied. The great Cotton's pavilion was an office that smelled of milk and ink. There she audited lines that others treated. As scenery were the fodder carts reaching the eastern stations on the dates promised. Had the province promised at the last Coraltai sent 300 sheep or only pledged them? Which governor's wife had quietly distributed bread when her husband would have sat on his hands to avoid admitting the granary was short? Bert's memory for such specifics made generals uncomfortable and made the state work. She kept a cur. Census of the vulnerable widows, orphans, men crippled in service, and a record of which captains responded without being asked. Rewards and punishments issued from that ledger, not from whim. When she died, the Ordo did not fall silent. It changed key. The day began with the usual bustle, and then ripples moved through the cart lanes, the way birds rise when a hawk is too far to see. Men paused at the entrance to her pavilion the way sons pause at a closed door after a difficult winter. The funeral was unspectacular by later standards, no. Mountains sealed with angry stones. No copper masks, just the weight of a community that knew which hands had portioned its food for years. Her daughters sat where she would have and began to execute the list she left. This road needs staves. This post's horses are too thin. This governor must be replaced before snow. The continuity comforted the nervous, but grief had a political shape. Without Bert, mediation inside the family could harden into position. Succession returned to the table with the yet sharper. Jokie's death reached the Ordo like a wind that no one wanted to feel. He died far west, leaving sons who would ride in history as founders of the Golden Horde. But his absence from the center removed a long argument without settling it. Chagatai, the law's public defender, recognized Gedai publicly, even if privately he gritted his teeth at compromise. Tolu supported the decision like a pillar holding more weight than it admits. The mother who could have demanded that patience for another season was gone. In her place remained habits. The weekly council carried on. The yam still rang with hoofbeats. Ovens kept warming the men who returned after patrol. Those habits preserved. The system long enough for the formal decision daddy. As Grey Con to be accepted without helmets banging against shields. Geddy's court put flesh on Bert's routines. He preferred delegation to dominance. He allowed his Hedon and Persian advisors to set revenue, collection rules that kept peasants from abandoning their fields out of despair. He turned the Ordo into a city with street scaracorums layout, mirrored the tent lanes so that a traveler who had never seen a city could still find where he was supposed to go. Craftsmen imported from beaten capitals were given work and wives instead of being exhibited like trophies. Embassies from distant kings discovered that a man who loved wine and survival could make hard choices on time. Under him, the Pax Mongolica began to feel like an institution, not a rumor pinned to one man's charisma. The Empire's household logic continued to power Har strategy. The great hunt mass encirclement of animals over miles. Then a coordinated closing of the ring doubled as a census of readiness. Officers practiced commands under stress, while cooks practiced feeding thousands in a place with nothing but breath and grass. The same tens, hundreds, and thousands that fought organized rivers of meat and bone back to the Ordo, while accounting clerks recorded who fed whom. It looked like ceremony. It functioned like a drill for war. Life in the provinces reflected the same overlap between home and state. In the on-God country, Alakai countered a drought before it could become a revolt by opening granaries and remitting attacks. She then wrote to the Ordo asking for seed and received it within weeks because the Yam treated her as a governor, not a petitioner. In the West, a Darugach, married to a princess, reorganized a caravan market, placing guards from two rival clans shoulder to shoulder so neither could accuse the other of theft without accusing himself. In a Chinese district, a princess acted as patron to a Buddhist monastery and a mosque simultaneously, as long as both fed the poor. The provinces learned to breathe together not because they were ordered to love the center, but because the center kept making breathing easier. There were failures. A station master stole from the post and fled. He was chased, not by a lynch mob, but by deputies with a written order that had traveled faster than the thief's horse. A governor tried to tax twice to impress an in-law. His wife, the Khan's daughter, sent the extra coin back with a note, "Do not embarrass me." A Daragachi grew cruel and was recalled. These were not the collapses of a brittle system. They were stress tests. The family, microscopy kitchens, marriages, the memory of women who cooked too many thin soups, caught the cracks before the rafters, groaned cultural life widened unexpectedly because law protected travel. Monks from India walked through cities. In the Ely, where Syriac Christians repaired saddles at stalls beside Muslim calligraphers writing Quranic verses and Chinese smiths pounding out knife sets. A Persian doctor learned Mongolian phrases for anatomy. A Uyghur astrologer wrote horoscopes for bored guards. Translators developed a tone halfway between amused and devout. Markets began to sell not just goods, but time how long it would take to get here from there if the passes were clear and the post houses stocked. Time being purchasable made people behave. The cost of all this was carried in the same households that made it work. Wives saw husbands, seldom in high summer. Children learned their father's gates by listening. Princesses understood that a marriage might be a decade of labor followed by a transfer letter written in 3 lines. Widow lists continued. The empire did not cease to be expensive simply because it ran on schedule, but the schedule paid back in something larger than victory, an expectation that tomorrow would resemble today in ways the poor could afford. Bert's absence haunted the Ordo in small moments. A quarrel between 2 senior women once settled by her glance grew into a slow frost across carts that shared a lane. An inspection began late because the clerk who always brought ink to the cotton's tent had no one to bring it to. A commander noticed. He made a plan to make sure ink never ran short again. Such corrections, repeated endlessly, are how grief becomes policy. When the family sat at council to finalize the great decision, G'days, succession words they had rehearsed. In kitchens and campfires framed the choice. Shagatai demanded clarity. Tolui promised support and guardianship. Joki's Sunsbaiter an Orderford loyalty with conditions about the West. The final consensus looked less like triumph than like relief, the way a mother's shoulders drop when she hears a herd returning after a storm. The Kurultai would ratify what the family had already agreed to live with. That was the domestic secret of the empire. The state made law in circles because families know circles prevent corners. Where knives hide. From the outside, the Mongol world looked like a cavalry empire that had learned to do paperwork. From inside, It felt like a family that had learnt to expand without falling apart by turning kitchens into boards, marriages into bridges, daughters into governors' sons, into poles holding the canvas high, and couriers into nerves that never quite stopped ringing. There would be more wars, and there would be a long roll call of people who paid for those wars without being asked whether they wished to. But the shape that lasted roads, standards, mixed courts, relay houses, marriage networks, the idea that law could travel faster than prejudice came from the same place as Temujin's first oath, a household hearing the wind and deciding to stay upright together. Empires tally grain, horses, and taxis with impressive care. What they rarely balance are the costs that cannot be carried on a cart. The Mongol world left ledgers of rations and remounts. It also left absences that do not stop charging interest streets, where language changed overnight. Fields sown by hands that no longer lived there, cities that were undone so completely that later maps draw them as rumor. To praise efficiency without adding these entries is to falsify the account. The casualty lists were never centralized. Chroniclers named a few catastrophes and then shrugged at numbers so large their ink ran. Merv Shaper, Ergenchich became a shorthand for death administered at scale. Even in places spared wholesale slaughter, the force of removal did its quieter work. Artisans were shipped east by the wagon load to make other cities shine. Blacksmiths and stonecutters went where garrisons needed their skill. Families followed or were left behind to renegotiate the geometry of their days. A settlement could wake with a new specialization and a hole where its old soul sat. The empire did not always burn what it conquered. It often transplanted. Transplantation, when chosen by the gardener, produces orchards. When imposed by soldiers, it produces silence in two places at once. The canal webs of Kharazm, built by centuries of attention to water that forgets neither kindness nor neglect, were cut accidentally and deliberately in the campaigns. Some were later repaired because the conquerors needed tax in cash and grain. Others silted into memory because there were not enough men left who could argue with the river. A city turned to dust claims more poetry. A province starved by a missing sluice gate does more damage. No document bears the seal for that decision. It is the decision no one made after the city fell, when the surviving overseer had no authority and the new one had not yet arrived. Enslavement followed paths we can still sketch. Prisoners taken on the field. Families caught in the retracting borders of surrender. Women and children claimed as property to pay the debt of resistance. Slaves carried water, cooked, stitched saddles, and were bought and sold until they became familiar furniture. In households that had once been poor, some were freed and became kin through adoption or marriage. Many more were not, and their names never reach us, because accounts rarely write down servitude as identity. For the empire's administrative men, such people were uncounted carries. For the empire's conscience, if it had one, they should have been the loudest line. The Mongols would say they did not enslave unknowingly. They made the bargain clear. Cities that surrendered early paid far less in bodies than cities that resisted late. This was the deterrence equation, repeated until it felt like gravity. Make surrender safe and resistance impossible, and war shortens. The principle works until it becomes pretext. Once a commander begins to keep score by the swiftness of capitulation, Cruelty offers itself as the cheapest instrument in the box. The trick of using fear for economy is that it proves addictive. Even a wise officer can begin to get results for the wrong reason. On the other side of the scale sat the mercy that administrators were told to practice. Artisans spared and relocated. Markets reopened under guard. Famine relief ordered from granaries the moment a province submitted. These acts, too, were principle and theatre. They taught observers that surrender did not mean the end of dignity. They also contributed to the myth that the conquering was a kind of violent planning. Cycle rather than a cord that strangle it. The two approaches make an example versus make a living operated beside each other like hands that never fully learned to coordinate. 3 deaths illuminate how revenge alters justice with time. Jamuka's execution followed rules. He asked to die without bloodshed and was granted the request, while his betrayers were punished for betrayal rather than praised for their target. The scene reads as fairness here. The fairness is calculated to teach the step. The new sovereign's detachment from personal pique, even as he ended the life of a friend turned rival. The death of Joker far away, his letters cooling into paper while his brothers, prepared to outlive him, removed a strand that could have tied east and west without slicing the rope. The argument about his birth never sounded in court again, but after his burial it echoed whenever Batu, Order, or Sheban wrote their cousins and asked to be treated as sons of the eldest. Justice here did not wear armor, it wore time. Khwarizms. Obliteration, begun with a governor's arrogance and a murdered caravan, outgrew its origin. The death of envoys makes every empire past and present humiliate. But somewhere along the long pursuit and the city sacks, punishment cleaned itself into policy, and still left the stain of anger on its sleeve. When historians assert that the Mongols practiced proportionality weighing surrender against resistance, they tell the truth of an equation that worked often. They leave uncounted the people to whom the choice was not offered or arrived too late. Children trapped in a city whose governor misread the wind. Refugees pushed back by closed gates. Families resettled as if human roots could be shaken clean, like dust from a blanket and re-sewn on command. The debt of those lives is not cancelled by the fact that caravan travel became safer or taxes fell under professional derogachi. Both entries sit on the same page, and the page does not balance. Women occupy that page twice, as those the system hurt first, and as those who kept it running. Victims appear in glimpses. A mother pushed her water cart when her city fell. A girl, given to a soldier as reward, then sold onward to a household that would never let her choose anything again. A noble widow required to accept a conqueror's bed as a diplomatic annex. They are numbers only when men write them as contributions to a lineage. Their work the breastfeeding that made couriers, the mending that made remounts. The hours praying for someone else's war plan ever enters the record with a name beside it. Governors appear in sharper light. Princesses married into provinces, governed at the level where resentment begins. Markets, taxes, grain relief, petty bribes. They removed officials who took a second payment for the same stamp. They opened storehouses in flood and ordered repairs without waiting for a letter to return from the Ordo. They negotiated the anger of merchants and the pride of husbands. When things went well, a city credited the great Khan. When they went badly, something quiet cracked inside marriages that had been inked to last as long as rivers. Women who excelled in this work found their names magnified in local praise for a generation. After that, their identity dissolved back into a single line: daughter of X, wife of Y, mother of Z. Diplomacy often travels as small talk. The empire's best envoys carried two weapons, memory and tea. Wives served both. A princess who knew that a certain Sufi master's favorite text was a particular book could produce the book on his birthday and secure an ally when drought made mouths tight. A governor's wife who remembered that the dam at the city's eastern edge always cracked 2 years after a harsh freeze could order the repairs secretly and then let her husband announce it. These acts turned policy into habit. A generation later, chroniclers wrote about wise administration and left out the conversation that made it possible. If one wishes to count debts honestly, even the good roads must be charged for what they are. Later aloud, the security of the Pax Mongolica connected monasteries and markets with a speed the world had not known. Ideas traveled as well as goods. So did disease. The plague wave that reached the Black Sea, and then Europe rode caravans and ships that obeyed Mongol passports and guard rotations. A conqueror does not create a microbe, but when he builds a highway, he must accept that both prayer and pestilence will take it. The bill for safety includes the cost of unintended cargo. The thought experiment that many avoid because it makes the story unstable goes like this. Remove a single night and watch the world rearrange itself. If Bert had not been carried off. Perhaps Temujin does not ride to the Merkets with help from 2 allies and therefore does not learn the tempo of coalition. Without that lesson, maybe he never develops the habit of turning private injury into public reform. Without the rescue, perhaps the young leader in exile remains a patient survivor rather than a man who can persuade other chiefs to let go of old rank. This step might have ended up under another clever horseman whose law stopped at his temper. Mercy might have been a rumor rather than a policy you could recite. Remove the caravan murder at Utra and the governor's pride, and the Khwarezmian war looks less inevitable. The Mongol machine would still have rolled. Perhaps it craved demonstration projects the way a new order proves itself to the undecided. But without the blood of envoys staining the argument, a slow frontier diplomacy might have continued to add cities by bargain rather than by sack. Traders would have spread the law without siege towers doing the explaining. It is equally possible. The empire would have withered under the attrition of small insults. Envy eats catagrams. Without a clear reason to act, fairness may hesitate until it is too late to matter. This is the trap. Contingency by itself cannot carry greatness. 1,000 kidnappings happened on the steppe. Few remade the rules. 1,000 caravans were robed. Few produced a campaign that changed 3 continents. The event matters less than the person and the system waiting to catch it. Holland's refusal to crumble turned a single abduction into a curriculum. Bert's return turned a husband's promise into a policy that protected many. The murder at Otrar turned into a war only because a leader had already gathered a team, capable of arguing with cities in the language of engineering, law, and speed. Contingency builds inevitability only when discipline is ready to inherit. There is another inventory worth making. A quiet list that sets deaths against new lives. Artisan resettlements, seeded towns that later wrote their own histories of prosperity and pride. Yuga scribes found their craft valued by people who had never before valued script. Merchants who once traveled under fear prospered enough to invest in caravanserais that later sheltered men who would never see a battlefield. Children were born into provinces where the judge was a local elder and the tax rate did not fluctuate with a cousin's hunger. None of these facts cancelled the graves. They make the arithmetic harder. The empire did real good with tools taken from the hands of those who had no say in how those tools would be used. It's fashionable to ask whether the ends justify the means. The better question here is, who gets to define the end? For men who received steady pay, a safe road, and a promotion, justice looks like a law enforced with teeth. For the woman whose city resisted because it did not trust that law and paid with the lives of her sons, justice is the last word a conqueror has earned. For the orphan whose name was written by a clerk in ink that still exists, the question lands differently than for the artisan whose father's shop was relocated to a capital he had never wished to see. The truth is that justice and vengeance share tools. At scale, principle always seeks an instrument that can be turned into pretext. Standing at a distance of centuries, one can admire the invention and pace the posts, the scripts, the decimal lattice that made men work together and still insist that the bill is not paid. Ethical accounting asks us to keep both columns open. Cities erased our lines we write in black ink. Offices that fed widows are lines we write in blue. Enslaved populations are not abstract. They are the unmarked, unpaid labor inside the lines we write in gold about achievement. Women are the bookkeepers who never signed their names in the ledgers they maintained. The empire's leaders knew something about debt. They despised unpaid obligations inside the camp and punished them faster than enemy raids. They rode the interest rate for disobedience in public blood. They forgave when forgiveness preserved order and did favors that compelled loyalty in advance. If we apply their rigor to them, we must admit that they left us with a balance sheet that refuses simplicity. They gave much and took much. They made stability from fear and kindness from calculation. They taught the world what a moving state could accomplish. They taught it, too, what a moving state can destroy without noticing. Perhaps the clearest way to end the accounting is to return one last time to the small tent beside a river, to the night when a bridal camp slept and strangers arrived and a future was torn away and then wrestled back. Without that night, the pages that follow might be blank, or they might carry different names in the same positions. With that night, everything that followed carries its mark. Revenge stretched across an entire horizon until it began calling itself justice and sometimes answered to both. An honest ledger keeps both words. Begin with a fire not much larger than a helmet. Wind presses the felt walls. Hooves creak in the darkness. A young husband kneels and swears that a theft will be answered. Everything else, post houses. Cities taken and repaired in folds from that ember. The line from private injury to continental system looks fantastical on maps. But inside a life, it is a series of small decisions that refuse to break. A marriage insult becomes a pursuit. Pursuit requires allies. Allies require rules. Rules demand messengers. Messengers need safe roads. Safe roads make markets. Markets attract artisans. Artisans require judges. And judges, if they act predictably, convince 100 towns they would rather belong than bleed. An oath spoken inside a single tent becomes the weather report for nations. When later ages call the Mongol state an empire of cavalry, they half remember. The horses mattered because they turned ground into time. But the more radical invention was the certainty that moved along with them. Rations arriving when promised, punishments arriving when warned, protection arriving when stamped. The relay posts are the clearest image of this certainty stables. Spaced like beads across the steppe, each prepared for someone who has not yet appeared. That readiness is the heart of the system. It is also the promise that keeps strangers from reaching for their knives. Those roads stitched together a continent that had previously been connected by rumor. Caravans noticed the difference first, then scholars, when letters from libraries. A month away began to arrive within a fortnight. Pilgrims who once traveled in fearful clusters under hired thugs now carried wooden passes and made friends with station masters. An Armenian merchant learned to greet in Turkic at one post and one wangi, to count in shiny 3 posts later. Sogdian accountants taught their Mongol partners how to spread risk across investments, and suddenly silk moved through winter like a trout through cold water. The network did not care who benefited most on any given day, so long as the contracts were obeyed by evening. Paths that carry goods carry microbes. The same certainty that allowed a chest of paper to reach a scholar in a distant monastery also allowed a germ to leap districts in days. The Black Death did not originate with these roads, but it traveled them as efficiently as a decree. This is not an indictment unique to the 13th century. Modern highways do the same work for viruses and mail trucks. The lesson is that infrastructure is moral only in its use. The route doesn't choose what it carries. When the world learns to move, everything learns with it. This web of speed and law left behind a trail less visible than stone one that rests under skin. Surnames wobble, chronicles lie, census rolls burn, chromosomes keep a steadier file. In parts of Asia, the Y chromosome pattern associated with the House of the Khan still shows up like embers when scientists darken the lights and look for a signal. The story told by that pattern has nothing to do with glory in a modern sense. It is a record of advantage repeated often. Access to brides, safety in travel, authority over inheritances. Power is not merely a map. It is a set of reproductive permissions written in the language of opportunity. Biology remembers what archives lose because DNA preserves the mundane who slept where, who survived a winter and who did not without needing to pass moral exam. Myths attach themselves to names, the way burrs cling to horsehair. In sun, villagers' families claim descent because a great-grandfather was promoted under a certain command. In others, because the new tax officer wrote down a household under a name that allowed them to keep land. The claim matters less than the function. A community chooses a surname like Khan so it can insert itself into a cosmology that awards dignity for belonging to something bigger. That move carries a truth even when the genealogy is invented. The empire flowed through people who were not nobles in ways that made their children stand straighter. Leadership lessons are easier to harvest than justice. Administrators love to list the practices that made the machine run. Clarity of command, contempt for delay, talent recognized. Above pedigree, counselors hired from cultures that had solved problems the Conqueror had not yet encountered. Logistics as love language. Tolerance not advertised as virtue, but enforced as policy so that priests and monks kept poor stomachs quiet during lean months. These are the managerial gifts the story keeps offering to later rulers, the parts that can be copied without needing. A cavalry herd? They work. Modern companies and governments repeat them with fanfare and are rewarded when they do. Then the bill arrives. It includes the people uprooted because someone needed their skills elsewhere. It includes the governor who enforced order by making terror more efficient than debate. It includes a child who forgot her mother's dialect because the household moved too far and too fast for memory to keep up. Great logistics don't absolve their consequences. They just move them far enough down the road to be paid by strangers. The moral arithmetic of empire refuses to zero out. Still, the roads never fully died. Long after klaxons replaced horns, merchants followed highway curves first etched by station masters chalking distances on wood. Recipes made journeys noodles here, dumplings there, flatbreads everywhere, proof of an earlier century's desire to borrow what tastes good. Words kept traveling long after borders changed color. An oath reached from a tent to a modern trading company's ethics guide. Deliver on time or lose the contract. The Yam's little contracts taught a large lesson. If you make promises dull and reliable, you will not need to swing a sword as often. Political theorists mine this era for the contradiction. They can hold without letting it cut their palms. On one side, severity that turns surrender into the intelligent choice and resistance into a headline. On the other, administrative mercy that rearranged cities so they could breathe after the wall shattered. Call it realism if you like. Call it a bracing rejection of romance. But do not forget that every spared artisan had a counterpart who wasn't. The ledger can hold both entries. The adult way to read the page is to refuse simplification. What does it mean for present tense life? That this is our inheritance. Consider how normal it feels to expect a package to arrive when your screen says it should. To assume that a messenger will be trusted because he carries a badge. To be outraged when a road is closed because an official failed to repair it on. Schedule. These are historic habits wearing hoodies and sneakers. Outrage at unreliability is a luxury purchased by predecessors who taught the world to prefer a calendar to a coronation. When the calendar fails for a pandemic, a blackout, a bureaucrat's pride, the anger that follows carries. The voice of riders who once demanded relay stations stocked when they needed water. Listening to the story in this light shifts the hero away from the general and toward the mundane promise kept. We celebrate the siege tower. We live by the clerk who arrives daily with a list the baker trusts. The war plan enthralls. The budget and the road crew allow the enthrallment to be more than a fable. This is not an attempt to flatten romance. It is a request that we make room for quiet excellence when we retell how the world was built. Return, for a moment, to the origin. Without a bride taken from her tent, no coalition ride in the first seasons. Without the coalition, no audience. With a future father and a future brother, and no early schooling in how to convert favors into rules. Remove a caravan murdered by a suspicious governor, and you might remove the war that spun the West into the habit of obeying schedules. Little causes do not guarantee big outcomes. They give disciplined people a pretext to do what they already know how to do. The difference between contingency and inevitability is the work performed between them. Today, the steppe is a place you can see from an airplane and misinterpret a sea of ripples that looks empty. It isn't. The emptiness teaches scale and scale teaches restraint. Within that horizon, the first oath was spoken. Beyond it, the relay posts spread. Beyond those posts, families called themselves by new names and learned to expect judges to show up on Mondays. Our own impatience with missed deliveries descends from riders who whipped station masters for letting haystacks shrink in winter. It is a strange legacy, this blend of cruelty and consistency. Yet it is ours. Biology continues the narrative without our consent. Men walk into clinics for hobby ancestry tests and come out feeling a tug toward a plane they have never seen. The tug is a story about probability, not destiny. It says that power saturated reproduction when the empire prospered, and that the saturation left signals for graduate students to publish. That a modern reader feels awe or unease at carrying a fragment of earlier violence is proof that memory resides in two places: in the mind's ethics and in the body's indifference. The lesson to extract is not pride but humility. Your veins have served more governments than your passport ever will. What then should we keep from this? Clarity wherever possible. Logistics treated like morality. Counsel taken from people who have solved a problem you have not. Tolerance enforced because it reduces the fires you must put out. Law practiced as a routine, not a sermon. All of it. Paired with an account book that refuses to write off the unpayable. If you administer anything, a business, a classroom, a city, those principles scale. But they do not absolve. They only guide. The last image to hold is not a horse charge or a corpse-strewn street. It is a night sky over a tent ring, the wind nosing the ropes, someone rising to feed a fire before dawn. That intimacy launched a global habit, and the habit has not finished teaching us. A private wrong taught a man to treat promises like weapons. An administrative genius turned those weapons into timetables. Timetables trained a continent in the luxury of expectation. From spark to sky, the weather changed, and now a choice turns back to us. The inheritors who travel roads drawn long ago and order goods from towns that once trembled at the sight of black banners. We can tell the story as a hymn to inevitability. Men doing what great men do. We can tell it as an indictment blood underwriting order, or we can tell it as a complicated inheritance that asks us to spend what was earned with care, to use the certainty we enjoy to enlarge other people's options, to keep our calendars without forgetting the cost, to build systems that do not need cruelty to stay awake. The fire at the start of this tale has gone to ash. The wind that shook it still walks the earth. If you stand somewhere quiet and listen, for hooves, you may hear only your own pulse. That is fitting. A single human story turned into climate. It left behind law and roads, fear and fairness, names remembered and names erased, and the knowledge uncomfortable, useful that empires are built from household vows extended beyond any household's control. What we do with that knowledge is the only part of the weather we own.